In the stillness of night, when the world grows quiet and your mind begins to settle, there exists a space where ancient wisdom meets modern restlessness. Tonight, we journey together through teachings that have transformed countless lives across centuries, teachings that whisper a profound truth. You are already enough, exactly as you are in this moment. The Buddha once said that suffering arises not from our circumstances, but from our endless pursuit of what we believe should be, rather than accepting what is. This journey begins with a simple breath, an acknowledgement that perfection itself is the greatest illusion we chase. There was once a young potter named Kenji, who lived in a mountain village in ancient Japan. He devoted himself entirely to creating the perfect tea bowl, spending years mastering his craft. Each morning before dawn, he would sit at his wheel, his hands covered in clay, his mind consumed with visions of flawless symmetry, unblemished glaze, and proportions that would make the tea masters weep with joy. He studied under the greatest potters, travelled to distant kilns, and experimented with countless techniques. Yet every bowl he created fell short of his vision. Some had slight irregularities in the rim, others displayed minor variations in colour, still others lacked that indefinable quality he sought but could never name. Years passed, and Kenji's frustration grew into despair. His workshop overflowed with hundreds of bowls, each one rejected, each one a testament to his perceived failure. Visitors would admire his work, praising the beauty and craftsmanship, but Kenji could only see flaws. He would point out imperfections invisible to others, explaining why each piece was unworthy. His teacher, an elderly master potter named Hiroshi, watched this suffering with patient concern. One autumn evening, as golden light filtered through the workshop windows, Master Hiroshi invited Kenji to join him for tea. The master prepared the ceremony with unhurried grace, using one of Kenji's rejected bowls. As they sat in silence, Kenji noticed something extraordinary. The bowl his master had chosen possessed a slight asymmetry, a crack that had been repaired with gold lacquer using the ancient technique of kintsugi. The golden seams caught the fading light, transforming what Kenji had considered a failure into something luminous and profound. Master Hiroshi held the bowl gently, his weathered hands cradling it with reverence. "This bowl," the master said softly, "tells a story that perfection never could. It has lived, broken, and been made whole again. Its beauty lies not in flawlessness, but in its authentic journey. When you pursue perfection, you pursue something that exists only in your mind, never in reality. The universe itself is imperfect, constantly changing, flowing between creation and dissolution. Why should your bowls be any different?" Kenji felt something shift within him, a tightness beginning to release. He had spent so many years fighting against the natural way of things, demanding that clay and fire and his own human hands produce something beyond their nature. Master Hiroshi continued, "In Zen, we speak of wabi-sabi, the acceptance of transience and imperfection. It is the understanding that beauty exists in the natural cycle of growth and decay, in the marks that time and use leave upon all things. Your rejected bowls are not failures. They are honest expressions of a moment, of the humidity that day, of the wood in the kiln, of your breathing as you worked. They are perfect in their imperfection." That night, Kenji returned to his workshop and looked at his hundreds of bowls with new eyes. He began to see each one not as a failure, but as a unique moment captured in clay. Some had the soft irregularity of mountain fog. Others possessed the rough texture of weathered stone. Each told its own truth. He selected several bowls and began using them daily, allowing them to develop the patina of use, the small chips and stains that come from living. Over time, these marks became part of their character, deepening their beauty rather than diminishing it. This teaching extends far beyond pottery. How often do we reject ourselves for failing to meet impossible standards? We compare our lives to carefully curated images, our bodies to digitally altered ideals, our achievements to others' highlight reels. We exhaust ourselves pursuing a perfection that moves further away with each step we take toward it. Like Kenji, we fill our inner workshops with rejected versions of ourselves, unable to see the beauty that others perceive clearly. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence teaches us that everything changes, nothing remains fixed, and clinging to any state, including perfection, brings suffering. When we accept this truth, we free ourselves from the exhausting battle against reality. We can appreciate this moment, this breath, this imperfect but authentic life we are actually living. The Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi, deeply rooted in Buddhist philosophy, celebrates the beauty of things imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. It finds profound elegance in weathered wood, in asymmetry, in the simple and unadorned. As you listen tonight, allow yourself to consider where you have been like Kenji, rejecting the beautiful reality of your life in pursuit of an imagined perfection. What if, like those tea bowls, your supposed flaws are actually what make you unique and genuine? What if the cracks you have repaired with patience and courage are your most beautiful features, golden seams that tell the story of your resilience? In ancient China, during the Tang dynasty, there lived a calligraphy student named Lin who sought to master the art of brush writing. She had studied the great master's work, spending countless hours analyzing each stroke, measuring the space between characters, examining the balance of ink and emptiness on rice paper. Her teacher, Master Chen, was renowned throughout the region for calligraphy that seemed to dance between control and spontaneity, discipline and freedom. Lin desperately wanted to achieve this same quality, but her own work felt rigid and lifeless despite its technical precision. Each morning, Lin would practice the same characters hundreds of times, striving for exact replication of the master's techniques. Her strokes were measured, her spacing calculated, her pressure controlled, yet something essential was missing. The characters she produced were correct but soulless, like beautiful corpses rather than living expressions. Other students, whose techniques were less refined, somehow produced work that breathed with vitality. This paradox tormented Lin. How could less skill produce more beauty? One day, Master Chen invited Lin to accompany him on a walk through the countryside. They followed a path beside a river, watching the water flow around rocks, creating patterns that were both random and inevitable. The master stopped near a grove of bamboo where wind moved through the stalks, creating shadows that danced across the path. "Watch the bamboo," Master Chen said. "See how it bends with the wind, never resisting, never trying to stand perfectly straight against the force that moves it. Yet it does not break. It responds authentically to each moment, to each gust and calm." They walked further, coming to a field where a farmer was planting rice. The farmer's movements were efficient but not rigid, rhythmic but not mechanical. He worked with the mud, the weather, the particular needs of each seedling. "Now watch the farmer," the master continued. "He knows the techniques of planting, but he does not think about them. His body understands the work, and his mind is free. If he tried to make each movement perfect, to place each seedling at exactly the same depth and spacing, he would exhaust himself, and the rice would suffer from his rigid attention." Lin began to understand, but the lesson needed to go deeper. Back at the studio, Master Chen prepared ink and paper. "I want you to write," he instructed, "but not to write well. I want you to write badly. Make mistakes. Let the brush move incorrectly. Abandon everything you have learned about proper technique." Lin was confused and resistant. How could making mistakes lead to mastery? But she trusted her teacher and attempted to follow his instruction. At first, her training was too strong. Even when trying to write badly, her muscle memory produced technically correct strokes. Master Chen laughed gently. "You cannot even write badly because you are still trying. Let me show you something." He took up his brush, dipped it in ink, and then did something shocking. He closed his eyes and wrote a complete poem, never looking at the paper. When he finished and opened his eyes, the characters were wildly varied in size and placement. Some strokes were too heavy, others too light. The spacing was irregular, the alignment crooked, yet the overall effect was breathtaking. The calligraphy pulsed with life and energy. It captured something essential about the poem's meaning that perfect technique could never convey. When I stopped trying to control every detail, Master Chen explained, when I surrendered to the moment and trusted my years of practice to work through me without conscious interference, the true art emerged. Perfection is the death of authenticity. It is a mask we wear to hide our fear of being fully present. This teaching illuminated a profound truth for Lin. She had been so focused on avoiding mistakes that she had stopped being present with the actual experience of making calligraphy. Her awareness was always slightly ahead of her brush, planning, correcting, judging. She was never actually in the moment of creation. The Buddhist concept of beginner's mind, or shoshin, suddenly made sense. It was not about lacking skill, but about approaching each moment with openness and without preconception, even after years of training. Lin began practicing differently. She still honored the techniques she had learned, but she stopped making them her master. Instead, she allowed them to become part of her, accessible, but not controlling. She practiced writing without judgment, without comparing each character to an ideal. She wrote poems about her own life, her own feelings, rather than copying the classics. She made mistakes and sometimes let them stand, discovering that what she had labeled as errors often added unexpected beauty or meaning. Gradually, her calligraphy came alive. It still contained technical excellence, but now that excellence served expression rather than constraining it. Other students began to ask her advice, noticing the transformation in her work. She shared Master Chen's wisdom, always emphasizing that the goal was not to write perfectly, but to write truthfully, to allow one's authentic presence to flow through the brush without interference from fear or ego. This teaching speaks directly to our modern struggle with perfectionism. We live in an age of endless editing, where every photo can be filtered, every word revised, every presentation of ourselves carefully curated. We have forgotten how to be spontaneous, how to allow our authentic expression to emerge without constant self-monitoring and correction. Like Lin before her awakening, we have become technically proficient at life while losing touch with the vitality that makes living meaningful. The Buddhist practice of mindfulness is not about doing everything perfectly. It is about being fully present with whatever is happening, whether we judge it as good or bad, success or failure. When we practice this presence, we discover that our fear of imperfection has been creating a barrier between ourselves and direct experience. We have been living in our heads, in our judgments and evaluations, rather than in the actual unfolding of our lives. As you rest tonight, breathing slowly, feeling your body against the surface beneath you, notice if there is a voice judging your relaxation, evaluating whether you are doing it correctly, comparing this moment to how you think it should be. Can you gently set that voice aside and simply be here, breathing, existing, perfect in your imperfection, complete in your incompleteness? In a Tibetan monastery high in the Himalayas, there lived a young monk named Tenzin who had devoted himself to meditation practice with fierce determination. He had read extensively about enlightenment, about the perfect peace and clarity that awaited those who practiced diligently enough. In his mind, he had constructed a detailed image of what his meditation should feel like, what signs would indicate progress, what experiences would confirm he was on the correct path. Each day, he sat for many hours, but his meditation was a constant battle between his actual experience and his expectations. When thoughts arose, Tenzin became frustrated, seeing them as failures in his practice. When his body grew uncomfortable, he judged himself as weak and lacking discipline. When he felt drowsy, he fought against it with desperate concentration. When he felt alert but not blissfully peaceful, he wondered what he was doing wrong. His meditation had become an exhausting exercise in self-criticism, each session another opportunity to fall short of his imagined ideal. His teacher, an elderly lama named Rinpoche Dorje, had watched this struggle with compassionate concern. One winter evening, after the monastery had grown quiet, Rinpoche invited Tenzin to his simple quarters. A small butter lamp flickered on a low table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The old lama prepared tea in silence, the ritual itself a meditation. When both held warm cups in their hands, Rinpoche finally spoke. "Tell me, Tenzin, what are you looking for in your meditation?" The question seemed so obvious that Tenzin answered quickly. "I seek enlightenment, Rinpoche. I seek the perfect peace and clarity that the texts describe. I want to achieve the state that the great masters have realized." The old lama sipped his tea slowly before responding. "And how will you know when you have found this perfection? What will it look like? What will it feel like?" Tenzin launched into a detailed description based on his extensive reading, describing various signs and experiences. Rinpoche listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement or compassion, or both. When Tenzin finally finished, the lama set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. "Everything you have described," Rinpoche said gently, "is a story, a mental construction, an idea about what enlightenment should be, and you are spending your meditation time comparing your actual experience to this idea, yes? You are like a person who refuses to enjoy the meal before them because they are too busy imagining a perfect meal they read about in a book. The meal you imagine may sound wonderful, but it will never nourish you. Only the actual food before you can do that." Tenzin felt a familiar defensiveness rising, but something in Rinpoche's kind gaze helped him soften. The Lama continued, "The Buddha did not teach us to achieve perfection. He taught us to see clearly what is actually here, right now. When you sit in meditation and thoughts arise, that is not a failure. That is the nature of mind. When your body experiences discomfort, that is not weakness. That is the nature of having a body. When drowsiness comes, that is not a flaw in your practice. That is the nature of being human, with human rhythms and needs." The old teacher reached over and gently touched the butter lamp, causing the flame to flicker wildly. "See how the flame dances? It is never perfectly still, never exactly the same from one moment to the next. Yet we do not say the flame is failing to be a proper flame. It is simply being what a flame is, responding to the air, to the quality of the butter, to invisible currents. Your mind is like this flame. It will never be perfectly still, perfectly controlled, perfectly anything, and that is not a problem to be solved. That is simply what you are working with." Rinpoche explained that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition speaks of two types of meditation, one focused on developing specific qualities or states, and another called simply resting in natural awareness. "You have been trying to force your experience into a predetermined shape," he said. "But true meditation is more about allowing what is already here to be seen clearly, without the overlay of judgment and expectation. It is about befriending your actual experience rather than fighting against it." That night, Tenzin sat for meditation with a different intention. Instead of trying to achieve a perfect meditative state, he simply allowed himself to notice what was actually happening. Thoughts arose, and instead of fighting them or judging himself, he simply noticed, thinking is happening. His shoulder ached, and instead of pushing through with grim determination, he simply noticed, discomfort is present. A memory surfaced, and instead of forcing it away, he simply noticed, remembering is occurring. Something remarkable happened. Without the constant battle against his experience, without the exhausting effort to make his meditation match his ideal, there was suddenly space. The thoughts didn't go away, but they no longer seemed so solid or problematic. The discomfort didn't disappear, but it no longer defined his entire experience. He began to notice moments of ease, of natural clarity, of simple presence that had always been there but had been obscured by his striving. Over the following weeks and months, Tenzin's relationship with practice transformed completely. He still sat daily, still worked with traditional techniques, but he had stopped using meditation as a way to judge himself. Instead, it became a kind laboratory for understanding the nature of his own mind, with all its quirks and patterns and humanity. He discovered that the peace he had been seeking was not something he needed to create or achieve. It was already present underneath his agitation, accessible whenever he stopped fighting against what was. This understanding aligned with a core Buddhist teaching, that our true nature is already complete, already whole, already peaceful. We do not need to become something we are not. We need only to recognize what we already are beneath the layers of conditioning, judgment, and striving. The great Zen master Dogen wrote that practice and enlightenment are one, not separate stages, but a single reality. We do not practice to achieve enlightenment in the future. Practice itself, when done with acceptance and presence, is the expression of enlightenment. For those of us who do not live in monasteries, this teaching has profound implications. We approach so many areas of our lives the way Tenzin initially approached meditation, with rigid expectations, constant self-judgment, and a belief that our current experience is somehow inadequate. We think we will be happy when we achieve certain goals, when we fix our flaws, when we finally become the person we believe we should be. Meanwhile, actual life is happening right now, in this imperfect, messy, ever-changing moment. What if you approached your life the way Tenzin learned to approach meditation? What if, instead of constantly evaluating whether you measure up to some imagined ideal, you simply noticed what is actually happening? What if you befriended your actual experience rather than fighting against it? This does not mean passive acceptance of harmful situations or abandoning growth and change. It means releasing the exhausting battle against the fundamental nature of being human, which includes imperfection, change, vulnerability, and mortality. In medieval Korea, there was a temple famous for its garden, considered one of the most beautiful in all the land. Monks and nobles would travel great distances to walk among its carefully arranged rocks, admire its raked gravel patterns, and meditate beside its tranquil pond. The garden master, a monk named Sunim Jin, had spent decades perfecting every detail, ensuring that each stone, each plant, each sightline reflected aesthetic perfection and spiritual harmony. He was known for his exacting standards and his ability to see the slightest imperfection. One spring, a severe storm swept through the region, bringing violent winds and torrential rain. When the storm finally passed, Sunim Jin emerged to find his beloved garden devastated. The carefully raked gravel patterns were scattered and eroded. Several large rocks had shifted from their precisely calculated positions. An ancient cherry tree, positioned to create the perfect frame for viewing the morning sun, had been partially uprooted and now leaned at a wild angle. Branches and debris covered the meticulously maintained paths. Sunim Jin stood in the ruined garden, and for a long moment, something interesting happened within him. He expected to feel devastated, to immediately begin planning the enormous restoration work that lay ahead. Instead, he felt a strange stillness, an unexpected openness. He walked slowly through the transformed space, seeing it as if for the first time. The shifted rocks created new relationships, new conversations between stone and space. The scattered gravel, no longer in perfect patterns, caught the morning light in ways he had never noticed. The leaning cherry tree, which should have seemed wrong, actually created a compelling tension, a sense of dynamic movement frozen in time. He spent the entire day simply walking, looking, sitting in different spots, allowing this new version of the garden to reveal itself to him. By evening, he had made a decision that shocked the other monks. He would not restore the garden to its previous perfection. Instead, he would work with what the storm had created, enhancing and refining this new arrangement rather than erasing it. Some monks were confused, even critical. They reminded him of the decades of careful work that had created the garden's famous perfection. But Sunim Jin was unmoved. "I spent 30 years creating a garden that expressed my idea of perfection," he explained to the assembled monks. "It was beautiful, but it was also a kind of prison. I was constantly vigilant against any change, any element that might disturb my carefully constructed vision. I lived in fear of storms, of falling leaves in the wrong places, of branches growing beyond their assigned space. The garden owned me more than I tended it. Now the storm has offered me a teaching. It has shown me that nature's wisdom exceeds my planning. These rocks in their new positions speak in ways they never did before. The leaning tree expresses something about resilience and adaptation that my perfect vertical specimens never could." Over the following months, Sunim Jin worked with the garden's storm-given form, making adjustments that honored both the upheaval and his own aesthetic sensibility. He stabilized the leaning cherry tree in its new position, rather than trying to straighten it. He arranged some of the scattered rocks into new configurations, leaving others as the storm had placed them. He created paths that acknowledged the new geography, rather than trying to impose the old patterns. Gradually, a different kind of beauty emerged, one that incorporated imperfection, change, and the unexpected as essential elements rather than flaws to be eliminated. Word of the transformed garden spread, and even more visitors came than before. Many found the new garden more moving than the old one had been. They felt it spoke to something in their own lives, acknowledged the reality of disruption and change that everyone faces. The leaning cherry tree became especially beloved, a symbol of persistence and adaptability. People would sit beneath it and feel permission to be less than perfect themselves, to bear their own burdens at their own angles. Years later, a young monk asked Sunim Jin which version of the garden had been better, the perfect one he had created, or the imperfect one the storm had helped shape. The old garden master smiled and said, "The garden I tried to make perfect was beautiful but dead, frozen in my controlling vision. This garden is beautiful and alive, still changing, still surprising me, still teaching me. I thought I was the master of the garden, but I was really its prisoner. The storm did not destroy my work. It freed me from my attachment to perfection." This story carries profound wisdom about control and surrender, about our relationship with plans and outcomes. We spend so much energy trying to arrange our lives into perfect configurations, investing enormous effort in creating exactly the right circumstances, the ideal conditions, the perfect setup for happiness. Then life, like Sunim Jin's storm, comes along and disrupts everything. Loss happens. Illness happens. Relationships change unexpectedly. Career plans fall apart. Our carefully constructed lives are transformed by forces beyond our control. In these moments, we have a choice similar to the one Sunim Jin faced. We can exhaust ourselves trying to restore what was, fighting against the new reality, viewing any deviation from our perfect plan as a disaster, or we can take a breath, look around at what actually is, and discover what possibilities the disruption has revealed. This does not mean being happy about loss, or pretending that painful changes are somehow good. It means not adding unnecessary suffering on top of inevitable pain, by insisting that reality should be different than it is. The Buddhist concept of non-attachment is often misunderstood as not caring about anything. True non-attachment is actually caring deeply while holding outcomes loosely, engaging fully while accepting that we cannot control results. Sunim Jin loved his garden passionately both before and after the storm. The difference was that his attachment to a specific version of perfection had been replaced by an openness to what the garden was becoming. He moved from trying to control nature to collaborating with it. In your own life, where have storms disrupted your perfect plans? Where have you been exhausting yourself trying to restore what was, rather than discovering what is trying to emerge? The leaning cherry tree in your life, the thing that seems wrong because it does not match your vision, might actually be the most interesting and meaningful element if you could see it with fresh eyes. What if your imperfect life, with all its unexpected turns and unwanted changes, is actually more beautiful and authentic than the perfect life you imagined? As you drift towards sleep tonight, you can release the burden of keeping everything perfectly arranged. You can let the day's small disruptions and imperfections be what they are, neither disasters nor personal failures. Just the natural texture of being alive in an unpredictable world. Tomorrow will bring its own weather, its own small storms and unexpected sunshine. And you do not need to control any of it perfectly. You need only to show up and respond with as much wisdom and compassion as you can find in each moment. In ancient India, during the time when the Buddha walked the earth, there was a wealthy merchant named Ananda who had achieved everything his society considered success. He owned trading companies that spanned multiple regions, lived in a magnificent home, wore fine clothes, and was respected throughout his community. Yet despite all this, he felt a persistent dissatisfaction, a sense that something essential was missing. He had heard of the Buddha's teachings and decided to seek an audience, hoping to find the missing piece that would complete his perfect life. When Ananda finally met the Buddha, he immediately began listing his accomplishments and asking what else he should acquire or achieve to find lasting happiness. The Buddha listened patiently to this recitation of successes, then asked a simple question. Ananda, tell me about your breathing right now. The merchant was confused by this seemingly irrelevant question, but he paused and noticed his breath. It is quick and shallow, he reported. Why is your breath quick and shallow? The Buddha asked. Ananda had to think about this. I suppose because I am anxious, even excited, hoping you will give me the secret to perfect happiness. The Buddha smiled gently. Your breath reveals a truth your words tried to hide, even as you list your accomplishments. Even as you present yourself as successful, your body expresses anxiety and incompleteness. You are here seeking perfection, seeking the final achievement that will allow you to rest and be satisfied. But tell me, after each success you have had, how long did the satisfaction last before you began seeking the next thing? Ananda reflected honestly. Not long. Sometimes only days or hours before I started thinking about the next goal, the next acquisition, the next achievement. The Buddha nodded. This is the nature of seeking happiness through external perfection. It is like drinking salt water when you are thirsty. Each drink creates more thirst rather than quenching it. You will never achieve enough, acquire enough, or perfect enough to satisfy the craving, because the craving itself is the problem, not the solution. This was not what Ananda wanted to hear. He had come seeking advice on how to complete his perfect life, and instead, he was being told that his entire approach was flawed. But surely, Ananda protested, there is some state, some achievement, some way of being that is correct, that represents the end of the journey. The Buddha shook his head slowly. You are still thinking in terms of perfection, of arriving at a final destination. But life is not a destination to reach. It is a process to engage with. You ask me for the secret to perfect happiness, but there is no such thing. There is only this moment, and the choice of how you meet it. The Buddha continued, look at your breathing now. Ananda noticed that it had slowed somewhat during the conversation, becoming deeper and more regular. Your breath is always changing, never perfect, never complete, always in process. Sometimes it is fast, sometimes slow, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow. Sometimes you notice it, usually you do not. Yet it sustains your life perfectly without being perfect. Your life is the same. It is always changing, never complete, never matching any ideal. Yet it is your actual life, the only one you have, already perfect in its imperfection. Ananda felt something crack open inside him, a release of tension he had carried for so long that he had forgotten it was there. He realized that his entire life had been organized around trying to achieve a state of perfect completion. where he could finally relax and be satisfied. But that state was imaginary, always receding into the future, never actually present. Meanwhile, his actual life was happening in moments he barely noticed, moments he rushed through in pursuit of some better moment ahead. The Buddha gave Ananda a practice. For the next week, I want you to notice your breath regularly throughout the day, not to control it or perfect it, simply to notice it as it is. Quick or slow, deep or shallow, comfortable or uncomfortable. Just notice without judgment. And when you notice your breath, also notice whatever else is present in that moment. The sounds, the sensations, the thoughts, the feelings. Again, not to change anything or perfect anything, simply to notice what is actually here. Ananda practiced as instructed, and the experience was revelatory. He discovered that his actual life, the one happening beneath his constant planning and striving, was incredibly rich. There were thousands of small moments he had been missing entirely, his attention always projected into the future or lost in evaluation of the past. The taste of his morning tea, the feeling of sunlight on his skin, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the satisfaction of work done with attention. These experiences had always been present, but he had been too busy pursuing perfection to notice them. He also noticed how much suffering he created through comparison and judgment. Every experience was immediately evaluated as good or bad, moving him toward or away from his ideal. Even pleasant moments were tainted by his awareness that they would end, that they were not perfect enough, that he should be experiencing something better. He saw how exhausting this constant evaluation was, how it kept him perpetually dissatisfied, regardless of circumstances. Over time, something began to shift in Ananda's relationship with his life. He still ran his businesses, still engaged with his family and community, still had goals and plans. But these activities were no longer driven by a desperate need to achieve some perfect state. They became expressions of his engagement with life, rather than attempts to escape inadequacy. When things went well, he could appreciate them without clinging. When things went poorly, he could learn from them without self-condemnation. He discovered a kind of peace that was not dependent on perfect circumstances, a satisfaction that came from showing up fully to whatever was happening rather than always wishing for something else. Years later, Ananda himself became a teacher, sharing what he had learned with others who suffered from the same perfectionism that had once tormented him. He would often tell them, "I spent decades trying to create a perfect life, and I was miserable despite my success. Now I have an imperfect life, full of challenges and changes and things beyond my control, and I am at peace. The difference is not in my circumstances. The difference is that I stopped fighting against the fundamental nature of reality." This teaching addresses one of the core delusions of our age, that happiness comes from achieving perfect circumstances. We are surrounded by messages suggesting that if we just had the right body, the right job, the right relationship, the right house, the right life, then we would finally be happy. This belief drives enormous industries and creates enormous suffering. Like Ananda before his awakening, we exhaust ourselves in pursuit of a perfection that does not exist, meanwhile, missing the imperfect but real life that is already here. The practice the Buddha gave to Ananda, simple awareness of breathing and present moment experience, is the foundation of mindfulness meditation. But it is not really about meditation as a formal practice. It is about remembering to actually live your life instead of constantly evaluating it, planning it, and comparing it to some ideal. Your breath, happening right now, is not perfect. Your life, happening right now, is not perfect. And both are completely adequate, completely enough, already whole in their incompleteness. In a monastery in northern Thailand, there lived a monk named Bhikkhu Som who had developed a reputation for his rigorous practice and scholarly understanding of Buddhist texts. He could recite countless sutras from memory, had mastered complex philosophical arguments, and maintained a meditation practice that impressed even senior monks with its discipline and duration. Yet despite all this knowledge and practice, he felt something was fundamentally missing. His understanding remained intellectual, his practice felt mechanical, and the peace the teachings promised seemed always just beyond reach. One day, the monastery welcomed a wandering forest monk, an elderly teacher named Ajahn Maha, who had spent 40 years practicing in the wilderness. Unlike Bhikkhu Som, Ajahn Maha had studied very little formal philosophy and could barely read. Yet there was something about his presence, a quality of ease and genuine peace that drew people to him. Bhikkhu Som found himself both attracted to and threatened by this unschooled monk, whose wisdom seemed to flow from direct experience rather than textual study. During a community gathering, someone asked Ajahn Maha about the path to perfecting one's practice. The old forest monk was quiet for a long moment, then began to laugh, a genuine, belly-deep laugh that seemed almost inappropriate given the seriousness of the question. When he finally composed himself, he said, "Perfect practice? I don't know anything about perfect practice. I only know about honest practice. In the forest, I spent years trying to perfect my meditation, trying to achieve the special states and experiences I had read about. I was so busy trying to meditate perfectly that I forgot to actually meditate." He continued, "One rainy season, I became very ill, fever, chills, unable to keep food down. I was too sick to maintain my usual practice, too weak even to sit up properly. I could only lie on my sleeping mat, aware of the misery of the body, the disappointment of not being able to practice properly. And then something shifted. I realized I was still trying to control my experience, still trying to make even illness happen in the right way. So I stopped. I just let myself be sick, be weak, be imperfect. And in that surrender, I understood something I had missed in 20 years of perfect practice." Bhikkhu Som leaned forward, intensely interested. "What did you understand?" The old monk smiled. "That there is no such thing as correct experience or incorrect experience. There is only experience. The Buddha did not teach us to have perfect experiences. He taught us to be present with whatever experience is actually arising, to see its nature clearly, to understand that it is impermanent, unsatisfactory when clung to, and not self. Whether you are sitting in perfect posture, having profound insights, or lying in your own waste, too sick to move, the teaching applies equally. The content of your experience is not what matters. Your relationship to that content is everything." This teaching shook something loose in Bhikkhu Som. He had been so focused on achieving special states, on perfecting his practice, on having the right experiences and avoiding the wrong ones. He had been treating Buddhism as a performance art, where the goal was to execute the techniques flawlessly. But Ajahn Maha was pointing to something much more radical, that the practice is not about controlling your experience, but about clearly seeing whatever experience arises without preference, without judgment about whether it is spiritual enough or advanced enough or correct enough. After the gathering, Bhikkhu Som sought out Ajahn Maha privately. "I have been practicing for many years," he confessed. "But hearing you speak, I realize I have been approaching it all wrong. I have been trying to use the Dharma to perfect myself, to become a better, more spiritual version of me. But this is just another form of ego, isn't it? Just another way of rejecting what I am and seeking something else." The old monk nodded slowly. The ego is very clever. It can even turn spiritual practice into a project of self-improvement, another way to seek perfection and feel superior. But true Dharma practice is about seeing through the illusion of a separate self that needs to be perfected. When you really see that there is no solid, permanent self to improve, then the whole project of perfection collapses. What remains is just this: breathing, sensations, awareness, phenomena arising and passing. Nothing to perfect, because there is no one to be perfect. This conversation marked a turning point for Bhikkhu Som. He began approaching his practice with less ambition and more honesty. When his meditation was calm and focused, he noticed that with interest but without attachment. When his meditation was scattered and difficult, he noticed that too with the same interest and lack of attachment. He stopped comparing each session to some ideal and started actually being present for what each session was. He discovered that his most profound insights often arose during the difficult sessions he had previously judged as failures. He also began to question his relationship with his scholarly knowledge. He had accumulated so much information about Buddhism, but how much wisdom did he actually embody? He could recite teachings about non-attachment, but was he attached to his identity as a learned monk? He could explain the concept of beginner's mind, but did he actually approach his life with openness and curiosity? He realized that his knowledge had become a kind of armor, protecting him from the vulnerability of not knowing, of being imperfect, of being a genuine beginner on a genuine journey. Gradually, Bhikkhu Som's reputation in the monastery changed. He became known not for his scholarly brilliance or rigorous practice, but for his genuineness and his ability to meet others where they were. Young monks found him approachable, no longer intimidating. He could admit when he didn't know something, could acknowledge his own struggles and doubts. Paradoxically, by releasing his attachment to being perfect, he became a better teacher and practitioner than he had ever been when pursuing perfection. The distinction Ajahn Maha made between perfect practice and honest practice is crucial for understanding spiritual life, but it also applies far beyond formal meditation or religious contexts. We live in a culture obsessed with optimization, with life hacking, with finding the perfect routine, diet, exercise program, or productivity system. We treat ourselves as projects to be perfected rather than human beings to be understood and compassionately met. We accumulate information about how we should be living while often remaining disconnected from how we are actually living. Honest practice, whether in meditation or in daily life, means showing up to reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be. It means acknowledging our actual thoughts, feelings, struggles, and limitations rather than trying to present a perfected image to others or ourselves. It means doing the best we can with what we have in each moment, while accepting that our best will vary greatly depending on circumstances, energy, health, and countless other factors beyond our control. When Bhikkhu Som stopped trying to meditate perfectly and started meditating honestly, his practice came alive. The same transformation is available to you in whatever you are doing. When you stop trying to live perfectly and start living honestly, engaging authentically with your actual experience rather than your idea of what your experience should be, life itself comes alive. The gap between who you are and who you think you should be begins to close not because you have perfected yourself, but because you have stopped rejecting yourself. In feudal Japan, there was a renowned swordsman named Musashi who had never lost a duel. His technique was flawless, his speed legendary, his tactical mind unmatched. Warriors would travel from distant provinces, hoping to study with him, to learn the secrets of his perfection. Yet Musashi carried a private burden that none of his students suspected. The more perfectly he performed, the more pressure he felt to maintain that perfection. A single loss would destroy the reputation he had spent decades building. Each victory, rather than bringing satisfaction, only raised the stakes for the next encounter. One autumn, Musashi received an invitation to visit a small Zen temple in the mountains, sent by the head monk who had once been his childhood friend. Seeking a brief respite from the constant pressure of his reputation, Musashi accepted. The temple was modest, home to only a handful of monks living simple lives of practice and manual labor. His old friend, now called Roshi Takeshi, greeted him with genuine warmth, seemingly unimpressed by Musashi's fame. During his stay, Musashi observed the monks going about their daily routines. He noticed that they did everything with care and attention. But nothing was done perfectly. The garden showed the marks of amateur tending. The calligraphy in the meditation hall was competent, but not masterful. The meals were simple and sometimes slightly burnt or under-seasoned. Yet there was an ease to the monastery, a quality of contentment that contrasted sharply with the tense perfection Musashi maintained in his own life. One evening, Musashi confessed his hidden struggle to Roshi Takeshi. "I have achieved everything I set out to achieve. I am recognized as the greatest swordsman of my generation. Yet I feel like a prisoner of my own success. I cannot relax, cannot make a mistake, cannot be anything less than perfect because I have created an identity that demands perfection. How do you maintain peace while being mediocre?" He immediately regretted the last phrase, but his friend only laughed. "Mediocre? Perhaps, or perhaps we are excellent at being ourselves, at living within our actual capabilities, rather than constantly straining to exceed them. Tell me, Musashi, when did you last experience the joy of learning, the freedom of being a beginner, the relief of not knowing? You have become so invested in maintaining perfection that you have stopped growing. You have trapped yourself at the peak you reached." Roshi Takeshi continued, "In Zen, we have a saying: before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities do not change. The perfection of technique is not what matters. What changes is the relationship to the activity, the freedom from needing it to be anything other than what it is. You chop your enemies with perfect technique while being chopped apart inside by the need to maintain that perfection. We chop wood imperfectly while maintaining inner peace. Which is the superior way?" The question hung in the mountain air. Musashi had no answer. That night, he could not sleep, his mind returning again and again to his friend's words. He had spent his entire adult life pursuing perfection in swordsmanship, believing that mastery was the path to satisfaction and peace. Yet here was his old friend, a mediocre gardener and adequate calligrapher, demonstrating a quality of being that Musashi's perfection had never produced. The next morning, Roshi Takeshi invited Musashi to join the monks in their work period. He was assigned to help in the garden, a task for which he had no training or talent. At first, Musashi approached it as he approached everything, with fierce determination to do it correctly. But he quickly discovered he had no idea what correctly meant in this context. Which weeds should be removed? How much should he prune? Where should he place the rocks he was moving? With no clear standard of perfection to aim for, he felt disoriented and uncomfortable. Roshi noticed his friend's struggle and came to sit beside him. "You are suffering because you do not know the perfect way to garden, yes?" Musashi nodded. "Good," his friend said. "Now you have an opportunity that your expertise in swordsmanship never provided. The opportunity to do something poorly, to be a beginner, to make mistakes without disaster. This garden will not die if you prune incorrectly. Your identity will not collapse if you place a rock in the wrong location. You are free to try, to err, to learn. Can you allow yourself that freedom?" Something shifted in Musashi in that moment. He realized that his pursuit of perfection had been paradoxically a kind of cowardice. By only doing what he had already mastered, by maintaining an image of flawlessness, he had been avoiding the vulnerability of genuine learning, the humility of being inadequate, the risk of public failure. His perfection was a fortress protecting him from the full experience of being human. He spent the rest of his visit working alongside the monks, trying his hand at various tasks he had no skill in. He made lopsided pottery, burned rice, swept floors inadequately, and gradually, he began to feel something he had not experienced since childhood: the simple pleasure of engaging with activities for their own sake rather than for the achievement they represented. When he returned to his sword school, he was a different teacher. Musashi began showing his students his own mistakes, demonstrating techniques imperfectly, admitting when he did not know the answer to a question. At first, some students were disappointed, having come seeking a flawless master. But others found this authenticity liberating. They felt permission to be learners rather than pretenders, to make mistakes rather than hide them, to focus on genuine development rather than the appearance of competence. The school's atmosphere transformed from one of tense perfection-seeking to one of genuine exploration and growth. Years later, Musashi wrote in his famous book on strategy, "In all things, practice without attachment to outcome. The master has failed more times than the beginner has tried. Perfection is not the goal, engagement is the goal. Be willing to be a beginner at every stage. The moment you believe you have arrived at perfection, you have stopped on the path and will soon be passed by those still walking." This teaching speaks to a trap many of us fall into once we achieve some level of success or competence. We become invested in our reputation, in the identity we have constructed, in maintaining the image of having it all figured out. We stop taking risks, stop trying new things, stop being honest about our limitations. We choose the comfortable prison of appearing competent over the disorienting freedom of actual growth. Like Musashi before his awakening, we mistake our carefully maintained perfection for mastery, not realizing that true mastery includes the willingness to be imperfect, to be a beginner, to not know. What areas of your life have you mastered to the point that they have stopped being sources of joy and become merely obligations to maintain an image? Where are you performing perfection while sacrificing authenticity? What might happen if you gave yourself permission to be mediocre, to try things you are not good at, to risk looking foolish or inadequate? The imprisoned swordsman in you might resist these questions, but the human being in you knows their importance. In a small village in ancient China, there lived a woman named Mei Lin, who was known throughout the region for her embroidery. Her work was so exquisite that wealthy families would wait years for her to complete a commission. Every stitch was perfectly placed, every color precisely matched, every pattern executed with flawless technique. She worked long hours by candlelight, often redoing entire sections if she detected the slightest imperfection. Her pieces were indeed magnificent, but they came at a great cost to her health, her family relationships, and her own peace of mind. Mei Lin's daughter, a girl named Lotus, loved to watch her mother work, but was forbidden to touch the precious silk and threads. "You are too young, too careless," Mei Lin would say. "This work requires perfection, and you would only make mistakes." Lotus accepted this judgment and instead played with scraps of fabric, creating small figures and scenes with whatever materials she could find. Her creations were childish and crude, but she made them with joy and complete absorption. One year, a severe illness swept through the village. Mei Lin fell desperately ill, unable to work for many weeks. During her long recovery, she could only lie in bed, too weak even to hold a needle. From her bed, she could see Lotus working with her fabric scraps, humming quietly as she sewed. For the first time, Mei Lin really watched her daughter's process, rather than dismissing it as child's play. What she observed surprised her. Lotus worked with complete presence, not worried about mistakes, not comparing her work to any ideal. When a stitch went wrong, she simply adapted, incorporating the error into her design. When she ran out of one color, she cheerfully substituted another. Her attitude was one of play and experimentation rather than grim determination to achieve perfection. And remarkably, despite the technical flaws, Lotus's little fabric scenes had a vitality and charm that moved something in Mei Lin's heart. One day, Mei Lin called Lotus to her bedside. "Show me what you're making," she said gently. Lotus brought over her current project, a fabric garden scene with slightly crooked flowers and trees that leaned at impossible angles. "It's not very good," Lotus said matter-of-factly, without shame. "The flowers are too big, and the birds are strange, but I like making it. It makes me happy." Mei Lin felt tears rising. When had she last said such a thing? When had she last created anything simply because it brought joy, rather than because it met a standard of excellence? She realized that in her pursuit of perfect embroidery, she had lost touch with the simple pleasure that had drawn her to needlework as a girl. Her work had become a performance, each piece a test she had to pass flawlessly. The joy had been replaced by anxiety, the creative play by rigid control. As Mei Lin slowly recovered her strength, she began working again, but differently. She set aside her commissions temporarily, and instead created pieces just for herself and her family, pieces that no one else would judge. She experimented with new techniques, knowing they might fail. She worked faster, accepting imperfections. She even invited Lotus to add small elements to some pieces, trusting her daughter's enthusiastic but imperfect stitching. Something remarkable happened. The quality of her work did not diminish. If anything, it became more lively and interesting. The pieces she created during this period had a spontaneity and warmth that her technically perfect earlier works sometimes lacked. When she eventually returned to taking commissions, she brought this new approach with her. She still possessed all her technical skill, but it was now in service to expression and joy, rather than to an anxious perfectionism. Her clients noticed the change. Some actually preferred the new work, finding it more emotionally resonant than the flawless but somehow sterile pieces she had created before. Others did not, wanting only technical perfection. Mei Lin found she no longer needed every client's approval. She could let go of commissions that demanded a kind of perfection that would require sacrificing her peace and joy. There were enough people who valued what she now offered. Excellence combined with humanity, skill combined with spontaneity, beauty that included rather than excluded the marks of life and hand. Most importantly, her relationship with Lotus transformed. They began working side by side, Mei Lin teaching her daughter technique, while Lotus reminded her mother of the joy of creative play. Lotus learned skill, but not at the cost of spontaneity. Mei Lin relearned spontaneity without abandoning skill. Together, they found a middle way that honored both discipline and freedom. Years later, when Mei Lin was an old woman, people would ask her about her most treasured work. They expected her to name one of her masterpieces, some perfect piece that had brought her fame. Instead, she would bring out a small, slightly messy fabric garden scene that she had made in collaboration with her daughter during her recovery. "This piece is full of mistakes," she would say. "The proportions are wrong, the stitching uneven, some of the color choices are quite strange. But it captures something my perfect works never did. The actual experience of being alive, of creating with love, of not being afraid to be imperfect." Mei Lin's story illustrates a teaching the Buddha emphasized repeatedly, that suffering comes from craving and attachment, including attachment to appearing perfect or having others view us as flawless. Her need for every piece to be absolutely perfect created constant anxiety, separated her from genuine connection with her daughter, and ironically kept her from creating her most meaningful work. When illness forced her to release that attachment, not by choice, but by necessity, she discovered that what she had feared, imperfection, was actually the doorway to the joy and connection she had been seeking. This pattern repeats across so many lives. We develop a talent or skill, and gradually it becomes our identity, something we must perform flawlessly to maintain our sense of worth. What began as play becomes work, then becomes burden. We become our own harsh taskmasters, accepting nothing less than perfection from ourselves while extending much more compassion to others. We forget that mistakes are not just inevitable, but essential to creativity. That imperfection is not a failing, but a characteristic of anything genuinely human. What is your embroidery? What area of your life has become so burdened with demands for perfection that you have lost touch with why you valued it in the first place? What would it mean to approach that area the way Lotus approached her fabric scraps? With playfulness, acceptance of mistakes, and focus on joy rather than judgment. The technical skill you have developed need not be abandoned. Like Mei Lin, you can keep your competence while recovering your humanity, can honor discipline while making space for spontaneity. As you settle into sleep tonight, you can let go of the day's performances, the constant monitoring of whether you met your standards, the harsh judgments about everything you did imperfectly. Like lotus's crooked flowers, your imperfect day was still a day of being alive, of doing your best with what you had, of participating in this brief, precious opportunity to be human. That is more than enough. In a monastery high in the Himalayan mountains, there was a tradition that each monk would spend one season alone in a remote hermitage as part of their training. A young monk named Lobsang eagerly awaited his turn, imagining the profound realizations he would have in perfect solitude, free from the distractions of community life. He had read accounts of great practitioners who had achieved enlightenment during such retreats, and he was determined that his own time would be similarly transformative. He prepared meticulously, studying the practices he would do, planning his daily schedule down to the hour, envisioning the perfect retreat. When his time finally came, Lobsang arrived at the small stone hermitage with high expectations and detailed plans. The first few days went reasonably well. He followed his schedule, completed his meditation sessions, and felt he was making good progress. But by the end of the first week, things began to unravel. His meditation was not producing the profound states he had read about. His mind seemed more distracted than ever. His body ached from the long hours of sitting, and perhaps worst of all, he felt bored, restless, and lonely. This was not at all the transcendent experience he had imagined. As the weeks progressed, Lobsang's struggle intensified. He tried harder, sitting for even longer periods, adding more practices, sleeping less. But the harder he pushed, the worse he felt. His meditation became a battle, his retreat a test he was failing. He began to berate himself constantly. What was wrong with him that he could not achieve what other practitioners had achieved? Why was his mind so defective? Why was his spiritual capacity so inadequate? He felt like a fraud, unworthy of his robes, unable to accomplish even this basic task properly. One particularly difficult morning, Lobsang sat down for meditation, feeling utterly defeated. He had been in the hermitage for 6 weeks and felt he had made no progress whatsoever. In fact, he seemed to be going backward, more anxious and unsettled than when he had arrived. As he sat there, tormenting himself with these thoughts, something unexpected happened. He simply ran out of energy for the struggle. He was too exhausted to maintain the effort of trying to meditate perfectly, too tired to sustain his self-criticism. In that moment of surrender, he just sat there, making no effort at all. And in that unexpected stillness, with no agenda and no expectations, something obvious became clear. The struggle itself was the problem. He had been treating meditation as a performance, his retreat as an exam, his own mind as an enemy to be conquered. He had been so focused on achieving a perfect retreat that he had not actually been present for the retreat he was having. All his effort had been aimed at escaping his actual experience in favor of some imagined ideal experience. No wonder he was exhausted and miserable. Lobsang sat with this recognition, feeling the truth of it settle into his understanding. He saw how he had been creating his own suffering through his relentless demands for perfection, his constant comparison between what was and what he thought should be. The monastery, his teachers, the tradition, none of them had placed these demands on him. He had created them himself, based on stories he had read and ideals he had constructed. He had been fighting against reality itself, insisting that his experience match his fantasy. From that day forward, Lobsang's retreat transformed completely. He let go of his rigid schedule and instead practiced in response to what each day brought. Sometimes he meditated for hours. Sometimes he only managed a few minutes before his mind or body needed rest. Sometimes he had periods of clarity and peace. Often he did not. He stopped judging each session as success or failure, and instead simply acknowledged what had happened. He began to notice the actual experience of being alone in the mountains, the sound of wind, the sight of snow on distant peaks, the taste of simple food. the feeling of his own presence in that small stone room. He discovered something that none of the texts had prepared him for, that the extraordinary is not separate from the ordinary, that the sacred is not different from the mundane. Enlightenment is not a special experience reserved for perfect practitioners. It is the clear seeing of what is actually here, stripped of the overlay of judgment and expectation and comparison. The wind blowing through the hermitage was not less holy than any profound meditative vision. The ache in his knees was not less worthy of attention than any blissful state. Everything that arose was simply what was arising, neither good nor bad, neither success nor failure, just the ongoing flow of experience. When Lobsang returned to the monastery at the season's end, his teacher immediately noticed a change. There was a settledness about him, a quality of ease that had been absent before. In their meeting, the teacher asked about the retreat, and Lobsang told the truth, that he had spent most of it struggling and failing to meditate properly, that he had not achieved any special states or profound realizations, that he had mostly just been uncomfortable and confused. But then he explained what had shifted when he stopped trying to have a perfect retreat and started being present for his actual retreat. The teacher smiled broadly. Now you are beginning to understand. The great practitioners whose stories you read, they also struggled, also doubted, also fell short of their own expectations. But those parts of their stories are less dramatic, so they are rarely recorded. What made them great was not that they had perfect experiences. It was that they brought awareness and acceptance to whatever experiences they had, pleasant or unpleasant, transcendent or mundane. You learned this the same way everyone learns it, by exhausting yourself in the pursuit of perfection, and then finally, having no other choice, surrendering to reality. The teacher continued, remember this teaching when you encounter future struggles. Remember that the goal is not to have perfect meditation, perfect understanding, perfect anything. The goal is to be genuinely present with your actual life, with all its imperfections and difficulties and ordinariness. This is much harder than achieving special states in meditation. Special states come and go, but learning to be present with what is actually here, that is the practice of a lifetime. Lobsang's experience in the hermitage speaks to a pattern many of us repeat in various forms. We approach significant opportunities, whether spiritual retreats, or new jobs or relationships, or creative projects, with idealized expectations. We imagine how things should go, what we should experience, what we should achieve. Then, when reality inevitably differs from our imagination, we interpret this gap as personal failure rather than recognizing that our imagination was the problem, not the reality. How much of your suffering comes from comparing your actual life to an imagined perfect life? How much energy do you expend trying to force your experience to match your expectations? And what might happen if, like Lobsang in his moment of exhausted surrender, you simply allowed your life to be what it is rather than fighting for it to be what you think it should be? This is not passive resignation. It is the radical acceptance that frees you to engage authentically with reality rather than with your fantasies about reality. In medieval Japan, there was a tea master named Sen who had devoted her entire life to perfecting the art of tea ceremony. Every gesture was practiced for years until it became effortless. Every element of the tea room, from the arrangement of flowers to the selection of utensils, was considered with exquisite care. Her ceremonies were famous for their precision and beauty, and students came from across the land to study with her. But Sen herself felt increasingly disconnected from the very tradition she had mastered. The ceremonies felt empty to her, performances she executed flawlessly, but without real presence or meaning. One year, a terrible fire swept through her town, destroying her tea house along with many of her treasured utensils, some of which had been in her family for generations. She stood in the ashes of her life's work, feeling a complex mixture of grief and, strangely, relief. The fire had destroyed not just her possessions, but also the burden of maintaining them, the pressure of living up to their historical significance, the weight of perfection they demanded. With nothing left but her knowledge and her body, Sen traveled to a small rural village where she had relatives. She arrived with almost nothing, wearing simple clothes, carrying no reputation. The villagers knew her only as someone's relative who had survived a fire, not as a famous tea master. A local woman named Yuki, learning that Sen knew something about tea, invited her to share a simple afternoon tea. Yuki's home was modest, her utensils ordinary, her knowledge of tea ceremony minimal. She prepared the tea with none of the precision Sen had spent decades perfecting, making numerous errors of technique and protocol. Yet Sen found herself moved nearly to tears by this simple, imperfect tea. Yuki was completely present, offering hospitality with genuine warmth, creating a moment of connection and care, rather than performing a perfect ritual. The tea was slightly bitter, the bowls were mismatched, the room was cluttered with the evidence of daily life. And all of it was real in a way that Sen's perfect ceremonies had stopped being. In Yuki's cheerful imperfection, Sen encountered the actual spirit of tea ceremony, which she had somehow lost in her pursuit of its perfect form. Over the following months, as Sen rebuilt her life in this new place, she began teaching tea ceremony differently. She still taught the traditional forms and techniques, believing they carried valuable wisdom. But she emphasized that these forms were like grammar in language, important to know, but not the point of speaking. The point of tea ceremony, she now taught, was the creation of a moment of genuine meeting, of presence, of shared appreciation for simple beauty. Perfect execution of the forms could support this aim, but it could also obstruct it if the practitioner became more concerned with correctness than with connection. Sen began creating ceremonies that deliberately included imperfect elements. She would use cracked bowls, arrange flowers with obvious asymmetry, make small intentional errors in the serving order. Students who came seeking to learn perfect technique were initially confused and sometimes frustrated, but those who stayed began to understand what she was teaching, that tea ceremony was not about perfection, but about presence, not about flawless execution, but about genuine offering, not about maintaining tradition unchanged, but about honoring the spirit that gave rise to tradition. One day, a famous tea master from the capital visited, having heard rumors of Sen's unorthodox teaching. He was initially critical, pointing out her various deviations from traditional forms. Sen listened respectfully, then invited him to experience one of her ceremonies. She served him tea in a bowl that had been broken and repaired, creating a visible crack that ran through its center. She arranged a single wildflower in a crooked manner. She made an obvious error in the sequence of movements. The visiting master grew increasingly uncomfortable, clearly offended by what he perceived as disrespect to the sacred tradition they both served. But as the ceremony continued, something shifted. Despite the imperfections, or perhaps because of them, the ceremony had an authenticity and immediacy that penetrated his criticism. The broken bowl became a teaching about impermanence. The crooked flower became a reminder that nature does not follow human ideas of perfection. The error in sequence became an opportunity for spontaneous recovery, demonstrating grace under unexpected conditions. When the ceremony ended, both masters sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, the visiting master spoke. "You have taught me something I had forgotten. I have been so concerned with preserving the tradition perfectly that I have preserved only its shell while losing its heart. You, by daring to break the forms, have accessed something essential that my perfect adherence had obscured." Sen bowed deeply. "The fire that destroyed my tea house was terrible and painful, but it freed me from the tyranny of perfection. Everything I lost was precious, but what I gained was more precious still. The permission to be imperfect, to be present, to be human rather than performing flawlessness." This teaching extends far beyond tea ceremony. In every domain, we face the choice between authentic engagement and perfect performance. In relationships, we can communicate authentically, with all the awkwardness and vulnerability that entails, Or we can present a carefully curated version of ourselves that seems more impressive but is less real. In work, we can bring our genuine interest and effort with their inevitable limitations, or we can exhaust ourselves trying to appear flawless. In creative pursuits, we can express what genuinely moves us, imperfectly, or we can produce technically proficient work that says nothing true. The Japanese aesthetic tradition includes a concept called wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. A tea bowl is most beautiful after it has been used for decades, developing a patina of wear and the marks of many hands. A garden is most beautiful when it shows the passage of seasons, the weathering of stones, the gradual changes time brings. This aesthetic is deeply rooted in Buddhist understanding of impermanence and non-attachment. It is a direct counter to the impulse toward perfection that causes so much suffering. What traditions or practices or areas of skill in your own life have become burdens of perfection? Where have you been maintaining the form while losing the spirit? What might it mean to bring Zen's hard-won wisdom to those areas, honoring skill and tradition while releasing the demand for flawless execution? The broken bowl repaired with care is more beautiful than an unbroken one, precisely because it carries the truth of impermanence and the marks of a genuine history. As you drift towards sleep, you can release the day's performances, the countless small efforts to appear competent and in control. You can be like Zen after the fire, stripped of the need to maintain a perfect image, free to simply be present, human, imperfect, and authentic. In the morning, you will rebuild, but tonight you can rest in the spaciousness that comes when we stop trying to be perfect and accept being real. In ancient India, there was a wealthy landowner named Rajan who prided himself on being a generous and moral person. He gave regularly to beggars, supported the local temple, treated his workers fairly, and was known throughout his region as a man of virtue. Yet despite this, he felt a persistent sense of inadequacy. He would hear stories of saints and enlightened beings who had completely transcended selfishness and ego, and he would compare himself unfavorably to these paragons. His generosity, he felt, was never quite generous enough. His morality was never quite pure enough. His meditation practice was never quite sincere enough. He was always falling short of the perfect enlightened state he believed he should achieve. One day, a wandering Buddhist nun arrived in his area, and Rajan invited her to stay at his estate while she was in the region. The nun, whose name was Priya, had a reputation for profound realization and unconventional teaching methods. Rajan hoped that by hosting her and serving her well, he might receive teachings that would help him finally achieve the perfection he sought. During her stay, he was the perfect host, anticipating her every need, ensuring she had the finest accommodations and meals. After several days, Priya called Rajan to speak with her privately. "You have been a most attentive host," she began, "but I notice that you serve me with a quality of desperation, as if you are trying to earn something through your generosity. Tell me, why do you practice such giving?" Rajan answered honestly, "I want to become a better person, to transcend my selfishness, to achieve the perfect compassion of the enlightened beings, but no matter how much I give, how much I practice, I never feel I am good enough." Priya was silent for a moment, then asked, "When you give to beggars, what are you thinking?" Rajan reflected. "I am thinking that I should give, that it is my duty, that this action will help me progress spiritually." "And do you notice the beggar?" Priya asked. "Do you actually see the human being before you? Or are you primarily focused on yourself, on your own spiritual progress, on whether you are giving enough?" This question struck Rajan like a blow. He realized with sudden clarity that even his generosity had been self-focused, another project of self-improvement, another attempt to perfect himself. He had been using other people's suffering as an opportunity to enhance his own spiritual resume. His giving, while materially helpful, had been emotionally disconnected because his attention was on himself and his own inadequacy rather than on the people he was supposedly serving. Priya continued, "The Buddha did not teach us to become perfect. He taught us to see clearly. When you see clearly, you recognize that there is no separate self to perfect. The idea that you are inadequate and need to become something better is itself the problem, not the solution. You are spending your life trying to fix something that is not actually broken, trying to become something you already are." "But surely," Rajan protested, "there is a difference between ordinary beings like myself and enlightened beings. Surely they have achieved something I lack." Priya smiled. "The main difference is that enlightened beings have stopped believing in their inadequacy. They have seen through the illusion of a separate self that needs to be improved. Your true nature right now is not different from Buddha nature. You do not need to become it. You need only to recognize what you already are beneath all your ideas about what you should be." She gave him a practice, simple but profound. "For the next week, whenever you do anything for someone else, give from fullness rather than from lack. Do not give to become better. Give because you have enough, because you can. Notice the person you are helping as an actual human being, not as an opportunity for your own spiritual advancement. And when you notice yourself judging your actions as inadequate, simply notice that judgment without believing it or fighting it. Just see that the mind is creating a story of inadequacy and let that be okay." Rajan practiced as instructed, and the experience was revelatory. When he gave without the burden of self-improvement, when he connected with the actual people he was helping, rather than using them as spiritual props, something loosened in his chest. The giving felt lighter, more genuine, more joyful. He began to notice that his constant self-criticism was not making him better. It was just making him miserable and preventing him from being fully present with others. He also noticed that his judgment of his own inadequacy was constant and automatic. No matter what he did, the voice of "not good enough" was there within minutes, evaluating, comparing, finding fault. But now, instead of believing this voice and trying harder to satisfy it, he simply observed it. He saw that it was just a pattern of thinking, not the truth about who he was. And interestingly, when he stopped feeding this pattern with his belief and his frantic efforts to fix himself, it began to quiet somewhat. Over time, Rajan's entire relationship with spiritual practice transformed. He still meditated, still gave to those in need, still tried to live ethically. But these activities were no longer driven by a desperate need to escape his supposed inadequacy. They became expressions of engagement with life rather than efforts to fix himself. Paradoxically, by releasing the goal of becoming perfect, he became more genuinely kind, more naturally generous, more authentically present than he had been when trying so hard to perfect these qualities. Years later, when people would compliment his virtue or generosity, Rajan would feel neither pride nor dismissiveness. He could simply acknowledge that, yes, he tried to be helpful when he could. Not because he was particularly special, or because he was trying to become special, but because helping felt like a natural response to seeing others' needs clearly. He had stopped performing goodness and started simply being good, or at least being human in the ways that felt authentic and caring. This teaching addresses a trap many spiritually oriented people fall into, using spiritual practice as another form of self-improvement project, another way to achieve perfection and escape inadequacy. But this approach misses the essential point. Buddhist teaching is not about becoming someone better. It is about seeing through the illusion of a separate, deficient self that needs to be improved. It is about recognizing that your deepest nature is already complete, already whole, already sufficient. This does not mean there is no value in practice, no reason to cultivate positive qualities or diminish harmful ones, but the motivation matters enormously. Practice driven by self-hatred, by belief in your fundamental inadequacy, creates tension and suffering even when it produces positive behaviors. Practice that flows from self-recognition, from seeing your basic wholeness, has a completely different quality. It is lighter, more sustainable, more genuinely beneficial, both to you and to others. How much of your own self-improvement effort, spiritual or otherwise, is driven by a belief that you are not enough as you are? What would change if you approach growth from a place of fullness rather than lack? If you practice because you could, rather than because you must? This shift from self-rejection to self-acceptance is not about becoming complacent or abandoning growth. It is about ending the war against yourself and discovering that peace is not something you need to achieve, but something you can recognize as already present. In a monastery in medieval Korea, there lived a senior monk named Jisan, who was responsible for training younger monks in meditation practice. He had practiced diligently for 30 years and had a deep understanding of Buddhist philosophy and meditation techniques. However, he had developed an increasingly rigid approach to practice, insisting that his students follow traditional methods exactly, without any deviation or adaptation to individual circumstances. For Jisan, there was one correct way to practice, and any variation from this perfect standard was wrong and potentially dangerous to spiritual development. One winter, the monastery received a new student, a young man named Min, who had come from a background of severe trauma and mental health challenges. Min struggled enormously with the standard meditation practices that Jisan prescribed. When attempting to sit in silence and observe his mind, Min was overwhelmed by difficult emotions and disturbing thoughts. Instead of the peace that meditation was supposed to bring, he experienced panic and dissociation. He tried repeatedly to follow Jisan's instructions perfectly, believing that his difficulty was due to his own inadequacy. After several weeks of increasing distress, Min finally confessed his struggles to Jisan, hoping for guidance. But Jisan's response was stern and uncompromising. "You are not trying hard enough. These are standard practices that have worked for countless practitioners. If they are not working for you, it is because you are not doing them correctly. You must sit through the discomfort, face the difficult emotions, not run from them. This is the only way to progress." Min tried desperately to follow this advice, pushing himself to sit through increasingly painful meditation sessions. His mental health deteriorated rapidly. He began having severe anxiety attacks and became increasingly withdrawn. One night, in a state of crisis, he ran from the monastery into the snowy woods, intending to harm himself. Fortunately, he was found by another monk who brought him back safely. This incident shocked the entire community. The monastery's abbot, an elderly teacher named Sunim, called both Min and Jisan to meet with him. He listened carefully to both accounts, then turned to Jisan. "You prescribed the medicine of meditation as if it were one size fits all, without considering the particular condition of this student. You insisted on perfect application of the technique without wisdom about when and how to adapt it. Tell me, if a doctor prescribed a standard drug to a patient who was clearly having a severe adverse reaction, would we consider that good medicine?" Jisan was defensive. "But these are the traditional practices, passed down through generations. If we start changing them for every student who finds them difficult, we will dilute the teachings and lose their power." Sunim nodded slowly. "There is wisdom in respecting tradition, but there is also wisdom in recognizing that traditions arose to serve people, not the other way around. The Buddha himself taught different practices to different individuals based on their capacities, temperaments, and circumstances. He was like a skilled physician, adapting the medicine to the illness, not insisting that every patient receive exactly the same treatment." The abbot turned to Min. "For you, at this stage of your healing, the intensive silent meditation that Jisan prescribed is not appropriate medicine. It is like giving strong food to someone whose digestion is still weak. You need different practices that can meet you where you are and help you gradually develop the capacity to work with difficult mind states." He prescribed for Min a program of walking meditation, chanting, physical work, and community connection, with only brief periods of silent sitting. Over the following months, Min's condition began to improve. The adapted practices allowed him to develop stability and some degree of calm without being overwhelmed. He built resources gradually that eventually enabled him to engage with more intensive practices, but only when he was ready, not according to some external standard of what practice should look like. For Jisan, this episode provoked a deep crisis. He had been so certain that his approach was correct, that perfect adherence to traditional forms was the only valid path. But he could no longer deny that his rigid insistence on perfection had nearly led to tragedy. He went through a period of doubt and questioning, wondering if his entire understanding of practice had been wrong. Sunim guided him gently through this process. "Your error," Sunim explained, "was not in valuing the traditional practices. It was in believing that perfect execution of these practices is more important than the well-being and actual progress of practitioners. You forgot that the practices are tools, not ends in themselves. A hammer is an excellent tool, but if you try to use it for every task, you will do much damage. Sometimes you need a screwdriver, sometimes you need a saw, sometimes you need to put down all tools and work with your bare hands." Sunim continued. This attachment to perfect practice is itself a form of ego, a kind of pride disguised as rigor. It is easier to insist everyone follow the same rules than to develop the wisdom to know when rules should be adapted. It is easier to blame students who struggle than to question whether your teaching method is appropriate for them. True mastery in teaching is not about enforcing perfect technique. It is about recognizing what each student actually needs and having the flexibility to meet them where they are. Jisan took this teaching deeply to heart. He began approaching his teaching role with much more humility and openness. He learned to really see each student as an individual with unique needs and capacities, rather than as identical units who should all fit the same mold. He became willing to suggest different practices for different students, to acknowledge when he did not know the best approach, to adapt timings and methods based on feedback, rather than insisting on rigid adherence to standards. Interestingly, this shift made him a much more effective teacher. Students who had previously struggled under his rigid approach began to thrive when met with appropriate practices for their particular circumstances, and students who did well with traditional intensive practice continued to receive that, but now within a framework of compassion and wisdom rather than harsh judgment. This story illuminates a crucial teaching about the difference between helpful discipline and harmful rigidity. Practice, whether spiritual or in any other domain, requires discipline and consistency. But discipline without wisdom becomes rigidity, and insistence on perfect adherence to forms becomes its own kind of attachment, its own form of suffering creation. The middle way that the Buddha taught is not about perfect practice. It is about appropriate practice, about wise engagement that takes actual circumstances into account. How often do we become like Jisan, attached to doing things the right way, the perfect way, even when our approach is clearly not working? How often do we blame ourselves or others when perfect execution of some method does not produce the promised results, rather than questioning whether the method needs adaptation? The willingness to adapt, to work with what is rather than insisting on what should be, is not a weakness or a compromise. It is wisdom. In ancient China, there lived a scholar named Wei who had spent decades mastering classical literature and philosophy. He could recite entire texts from memory, write poetry and prose that demonstrated perfect command of literary forms, and engage in sophisticated philosophical discourse. His essays were considered flawless examples of the genre, his calligraphy exemplary. He was respected throughout the scholarly community and held a prestigious position at the imperial court. Yet despite these achievements, Wei felt a profound emptiness. His perfect performance of scholarly excellence felt hollow, disconnected from any genuine meaning or purpose. One day, Wei encountered a simple farmer named Li who was bringing vegetables to sell at the market. Li was illiterate, had never studied philosophy or literature, and would have been considered uneducated by Wei's social class. But something about Li's presence caught Wei's attention. The farmer went about his tasks with complete presence and a quality of contentment that Wei envied. Out of curiosity, Wei struck up a conversation. "You seem remarkably at peace," Wei observed. "What is your secret?" Li laughed, a genuine, unself-conscious sound. Secret? I have no secret. I grow vegetables, I sell them, I care for my family, I sleep. What secret could there be? Wei found this answer both frustrating and intriguing. But don't you want more? Don't you aspire to achieve something greater? To perfect yourself, to rise above your current station? Li thought about this seriously. I try to grow good vegetables. Sometimes they are excellent, sometimes just okay. Sometimes the weather or pests ruin them. I do my best with what I have, but I do not torture myself about perfection. The vegetables grow as they grow. I am as I am. Where is there to rise to? This conversation planted a seed in Wei's mind. Here was a man who had achieved none of the things Wei's culture defined as success, who had perfected nothing, who had no special knowledge or status. Yet Li seemed to have found something that Wei's decades of perfect scholarly achievement had not provided: a simple ease with being himself, an acceptance of life as it was, rather than constant striving for it to be different. Over the following weeks, Wei found himself thinking constantly about this encounter. He began to see his own life differently. He had spent decades perfecting his scholarship, but to what end? To impress others? To secure status? To prove his worth? None of these motivations had brought genuine satisfaction. He was like an actor who had perfected a role, but had forgotten that acting was not the same as living. He could perform the part of the accomplished scholar flawlessly, but he had lost touch with himself beneath that performance. Wei made a radical decision. He resigned his court position, gave away most of his possessions, and moved to a small cottage in the countryside. He did not abandon his learning, but he stopped using it as a performance or a measure of his worth. He began writing differently, no longer crafting perfect essays to impress others, but instead writing about his actual thoughts and experiences, even when they were awkward or uncertain. He took up gardening, discovering that he was quite bad at it initially, but finding unexpected joy in the direct engagement with soil and plants and weather. At first, this transition was extremely difficult. Wei had built his entire identity around being the perfect scholar. Without that role, he felt lost and anxious. Who was he if not the accomplished intellectual? His mind would constantly generate judgments. This garden is poorly maintained. This writing is crude. This life is a waste of your education and talent. But gradually, as he stayed with the discomfort, something began to shift. Wei started to discover parts of himself that had been suppressed by his pursuit of scholarly perfection. He had a playful side that he had buried because it did not fit the image of serious scholar. He had emotional depths that he had ignored because they seemed messy and uncontrollable compared to neat intellectual arguments. He had a capacity for simple appreciation of moment-to-moment experience that had been drowned out by constant evaluation and analysis. One spring day, about a year into this new life, Wei was working in his garden when Li happened to pass by. They recognized each other, and Li smiled broadly. "How are the vegetables?" he asked. Wei looked at his modest garden, with its uneven rows and mix of thriving and struggling plants. "Imperfect," he answered, "but mine. I am learning that imperfection is not failure. It is just reality." They sat together for tea, and Wei tried to explain what he had learned over the past year. "I thought that by perfecting my scholarship, by becoming the ideal intellectual, I would find satisfaction and meaning. But perfection in that domain only made me more disconnected from actual living. You, without trying to perfect anything, without achieving what our society calls success, had found something essential that my achievements had hidden from me." Li nodded thoughtfully. "I think maybe you scholars make life too complicated. You have all these ideas about what should be, what is perfect, what is correct. But the vegetables do not read philosophy. They just grow or do not grow. The seasons change without consulting books about how they should change. Maybe wisdom is not about knowing the perfect way. Maybe it is about being present for the way things actually are." This simple statement captured something that all of Wei's classical education had obscured: The texts he had mastered were full of wisdom, but he had been using them as blueprints for perfection rather than as invitations to presence. He had been so focused on understanding life perfectly that he had forgotten to actually live it. He had confused knowledge about wisdom with wisdom itself, the map with the territory, the description of awakening with actual awakening. Wei never returned to his former life of scholarly achievement. He lived the rest of his years in simple circumstances, writing occasionally but without ambition, gardening imperfectly, engaging with his neighbors not as an intellectual superior, but as a fellow human being trying to navigate existence with some degree of awareness and compassion. Some of his former colleagues thought he had wasted his talents. Others, who had also felt the emptiness of perfect performance without genuine meaning, were quietly inspired by his choice. Near the end of his life, a young scholar visited Wei, having heard stories about the brilliant intellectual who had given up everything to become a farmer. The visitor asked Wei what wisdom he had gained from his years of simple living. Wei thought for a long moment, then said, "I learned that perfection is not the goal. Presence is the goal. I learned that an imperfect life fully lived is superior to a perfect life observed from a distance. I learned that the vegetables Li grows with no knowledge of philosophy contain all the wisdom I sought in classical texts. The seasons change perfectly without trying to be perfect. The rain falls perfectly without seeking perfection. I am trying to live like that, doing what I do without the burden of needing to do it perfectly." This teaching speaks to a deep confusion in our current culture. We have unprecedented access to information about how to live optimally, how to achieve peak performance, how to perfect every aspect of our lives. We have advice about the perfect diet, the perfect exercise routine, the perfect career path, the perfect relationship, the perfect morning routine. Yet for all this information and all this pursuit of perfection, are we living better lives than those who came before us without access to this knowledge? Wei's journey suggests that the pursuit of perfection, even when apparently successful, can actually separate us from genuine living. When we are constantly evaluating our performance, comparing ourselves to ideals, trying to optimize every choice, we are living in our heads rather than in our actual experience. We are performing life rather than living it. The farmer Li, with no special knowledge or achievement, was living. The scholar Wei, despite all his perfected abilities, was performing. What areas of your life have become performances of perfection rather than expressions of genuine engagement? Where have you been trying so hard to do things correctly that you have lost touch with why you were doing them at all? And what might it feel like to approach those areas the way Li approached farming? Doing your best with what you have. Accepting that results will vary, not torturing yourself about perfection, simply showing up and engaging directly with what is actually before you. In a monastery in ancient Tibet, there was a tradition of creating intricate sand mandalas as a form of meditation practice. These mandalas, made by carefully placing millions of grains of colored sand, would take weeks or months to complete. Each one was a stunning work of art, displaying incredible precision and beauty. A young monk named Dorje had been assigned to work on mandala creation and had approached the task with intense dedication. He wanted his mandalas to be absolutely perfect, worthy of the tradition, flawless in every detail. Dorje would spend hours on tiny sections, ensuring that each grain of sand was placed exactly right. If he noticed even the smallest imperfection, he would carefully remove that section and begin again. His mandalas were indeed beautiful, but they took far longer to complete than those of other monks, and the process caused him enormous stress. He could not enjoy the act of creation because he was constantly vigilant against any flaw, constantly anxious that his work might be somehow inadequate. The monastery's mandala master, an old monk named Rinpoche Sonam, had been watching Dorje's struggle with gentle concern. One day, he invited the young monk to assist him with a special mandala for an important ceremony. Dorje was honored but also terrified. Knowing that this mandala would be viewed by many important visitors and would reflect on the monastery's reputation, he was determined to perform perfectly. They began work together, but almost immediately, Dorje noticed something strange. Rinpoche Sonam worked quickly, almost casually. His placement of sand was careful but not agonized, and occasionally Dorje could see small imperfections, slight irregularities that the master seemed not to notice or not to care about. Dorje's anxiety increased. This mandala needed to be perfect for the ceremony, yet the master was being so careless. Unable to contain himself, Dorje finally spoke up. "Rinpoche, forgive me, but I notice there are some small errors in the mandala. Should we not fix them? Many important people will see this work." Rinpoche Sonam stopped and looked at the young monk with kind eyes. "Show me these errors," he said. Dorje pointed out several tiny places where the pattern was slightly off, where colors were not quite uniform, where lines were not perfectly straight. The old master examined each place carefully, then nodded. "You have a good eye. You see clearly what is here. Now tell me, do these small imperfections prevent the mandala from serving its purpose?" Dorje was confused. I don't understand. What is its purpose?" Rinpoche Sonam smiled. "Ah, an excellent question. What do you think the purpose of a sand mandala is?" Dorje answered immediately, reciting what he had been taught. A mandala is a representation of the cosmos, a tool for meditation, a sacred object that embodies the perfection of enlightened consciousness. The old master nodded. "Yes, that is what the texts say, but I will tell you a deeper truth. The real purpose of creating a mandala is not the mandala itself. It is what happens in the creator's mind during the creation. The mandala is the teacher, and the lesson is impermanence and non-attachment." He gestured to the partially completed mandala. "We spend weeks or months creating this with great care, making it as beautiful as we can. And then, when it is complete, what do we do?" Dorje knew this part. "We sweep it away, destroying it in a ceremony that teaches about the impermanence of all things." "Exactly," Rinpoche confirmed. "We create beauty, knowing it will be destroyed. We work carefully on something we will intentionally unmake. If the point was to create a perfect permanent object, this practice would be madness. But the point is to engage fully in the process while holding the outcome lightly, to create with care while remaining unattached to what we create." The old master continued. "You, Dorje, have been missing this teaching entirely. You create your mandalas as if they were meant to last forever, as if their perfection was the point, as if any flaw was a terrible failure. You torture yourself trying to make permanent what is intentionally temporary. And in doing so, you create suffering for yourself and miss the actual lesson the practice is offering." Dorje felt something crack open in his understanding. He suddenly saw that he had been doing the same thing, not just with mandalas, but with his entire practice and his entire life. He had been trying to create a perfect, permanent version of himself, fighting against any flaw, desperately maintaining an image of someone who never made mistakes, never struggled, never fell short. He had been treating his life as if it were meant to be perfect and permanent, when in truth it was temporary and ever-changing, just like the sand mandalas. "But Rinpoche," Dorje asked, "if perfection is not the goal, why do we try to make the mandalas beautiful? Why not just scatter the sand randomly?" The old master laughed. "Now you are thinking. This is an important question. We make them beautiful because we can, because creating beauty is a natural expression of caring attention. We work skillfully because we are capable of skill, but we hold this beauty and skill lightly, knowing it is all temporary, all subject to change and dissolution. The beauty is genuine, but the attachment to maintaining that beauty perfectly is where suffering arises." From that day forward, Dorje's relationship with mandala creation, and with practice in general, transformed completely. He still worked carefully, still honored the traditions, still created beautiful mandalas. But the quality of his engagement changed. He could enjoy the process itself rather than only worrying about the outcome. He could accept small imperfections without anxiety. And most importantly, when the time came to sweep away the completed mandala, he could do so without regret, having held its beauty fully while never clinging to it. Years later, Dorje himself became a mandala master, teaching younger monks. He always emphasized the teaching that Rinpoche Sonam had given him, that the mandala is complete only when it is swept away, that the perfection of the practice lies in its acceptance of imperfection and impermanence, that we create beauty knowing it will not last, because creating beauty is worthwhile, even when it is temporary, perhaps especially when it is temporary. This teaching of the sand mandala speaks directly to the heart of Buddhist wisdom about impermanence and non-attachment. Everything we create, everything we build, everything we are, is temporary. Nothing lasts. Nothing remains perfect. Everything is always in the process of changing, aging, breaking down, transforming. We can fight against this truth, exhausting ourselves trying to maintain perfection and permanence. Or we can accept it, engaging fully with the flow of creation and dissolution, making things beautiful not because they will last, but precisely because they will not. How much of your suffering comes from trying to make permanent what is inherently temporary? How much energy do you spend trying to perfect and maintain your body, your life circumstances, your relationships, your achievements, as if they could be frozen in an ideal state? And what would it feel like to approach these areas the way an enlightened mandala maker approaches the sand, creating with care, appreciating the beauty, and then releasing it all without resistance when change inevitably comes? Tonight, as you sleep, your body is changing. Cells are dying and being born. Memories are being consolidated or fading. Tomorrow, you will be literally not the same person you are today. This is not a problem to solve. This is the nature of being alive. You are like a sand mandala, beautiful in this moment and already dissolving into the next moment, and this process is perfect in its imperfection. In medieval Japan, there lived a young woman named Hana who came from a family of renowned swordsmiths. For generations, her family had created swords that were considered perfect examples of the craft. Balanced, sharp, beautiful, and nearly indestructible. When Hana expressed interest in learning the family trade, her father began teaching her with exacting standards. Every sword had to meet impossibly high criteria. Any flaw, no matter how minor, meant the sword was rejected and had to be melted down and reforged. Hana trained for years, learning every aspect of the craft. She understood the chemistry of steel, the temperatures of forging, the angles of sharpening, the aesthetics of design. Yet despite her extensive knowledge and growing skill, she had not created a single sword that her father deemed worthy to bear the family seal. Each one had some imperfection that disqualified it from being considered a true family work. Hana began to despair, wondering if she simply lacked the essential talent, if perfection was beyond her reach. One winter, Hana's father fell ill with a condition that left him unable to work. A samurai lord had commissioned a sword for an important ceremony, and the deadline could not be extended. For the first time, Hana would have to complete a sword on her own, without her father's oversight. She felt panic and responsibility in equal measure. This sword would be judged not just by her father, but by the client and the broader community. Her family's reputation rested on her ability to create perfection. Hana worked day and night, applying everything she had learned. She was meticulous in her selection of materials, precise in her temperature control, patient through the lengthy process of folding the steel, careful in the shaping and sharpening. Yet despite her best efforts, she could see that the sword was not perfect. There was a barely visible irregularity in the hamen, the wavy line pattern on the blade. The balance was slightly off-center. The curve was minutely different from the ideal specification. She stood in the workshop, looking at this imperfect sword, knowing the deadline was tomorrow. She could start over, but there was not time to complete another sword properly. She could present this one, but it bore the flaws that her father had taught her made a sword unworthy. For hours, She stood paralyzed by indecision, her mind cycling between her training in perfectionism and the practical reality that this imperfect sword was what she had. Finally, exhausted and with no other choice, Hana decided to present the sword as it was. She cleaned and polished it, mounted it properly, wrote the authentication papers with her family seal, and delivered it to the samurai lord. She felt she was bringing shame to her family name, that this imperfect work would reveal her inadequacy as a smith. She could barely watch as the lord examined the blade. The samurai studied the sword in silence for a long time. He tested its balance, examined the blade in various lights, performed several cutting tests with it. Finally, he spoke. This sword has character. It is not like the standardized perfection of typical masterworks. There is something individual about it, something that speaks of the smith's personal touch. The slight irregularities give it life, make it unique. This is not a perfect sword, but it is an excellent sword, perhaps more excellent than if it had been perfect. Hana was stunned. Everything she had been taught said that this sword was a failure, yet here was a skilled warrior, someone who understood swords deeply, praising exactly the elements she had thought were flaws. When she returned home and told her father what had happened, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Perhaps I have been teaching you wrong all these years. I learned to make perfect swords, but in doing so, I may have forgotten that the purpose of a sword is to serve its user, not to be a flawless museum piece. A sword with character that feels alive in the hand may serve better than one that is technically perfect, but cold." Over the following months, as her father recovered, they had many conversations about perfection versus excellence, about standardization versus individuality, about the difference between flawless execution and genuine mastery. They began to see that the family tradition of perfection had been both a source of pride and a limitation. It had produced remarkable works, but at great cost in stress, anxiety, and the rejection of many swords that, while imperfect, were still excellent and useful. Together, they developed a new approach to their craft. They still honored the traditional techniques and aimed for high quality, but they stopped insisting on absolute perfection. They allowed their swords to have individual character, to bear the subtle marks of their making, to be recognizably human creations rather than idealized abstractions. Interestingly, this shift made their swords more sought after, not less. Warriors appreciated the uniqueness and the sense that each sword was a one-of-a-kind creation rather than a perfect replica of an ideal. Hana eventually became recognized as a master smith in her own right, but her mastery was different from her ancestors. She had learned that perfection and excellence are not the same thing. Perfection is an abstract ideal, a concept in the mind that no physical object can fully match. Excellence is a quality that actual objects can possess, being well-made, fit for purpose, displaying skill and care, while still being imperfect. A perfect sword is an impossibility. An excellent sword can be created today, can serve its purpose beautifully, can have character and life to it. This distinction between perfection and excellence is crucial in understanding how to live without the tyranny of perfectionism. We can aim for excellence in our endeavors, bringing our skill and care to what we do, while releasing the demand for perfection. Excellence is achievable and satisfying. Perfection is neither achievable nor satisfying, because even when we get close to it, we are aware of how we have fallen short. What would it mean to pursue excellence rather than perfection in your own life? To do your work well, with attention and care, while accepting that it will inevitably bear the marks of your human limitations and the circumstances you are working within. To create things that have character and life rather than sterile flawlessness. This is not about lowering your standards. It is about making your standards realistic and human rather than abstract and impossible. Hana's first solo sword, the one she was ashamed of, the one she thought would disgrace her family name, turned out to be the beginning of her real mastery. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real, because it bore the authentic marks of her engagement with the process, because it had what the samurai called character. Your imperfect work, your imperfect life, your imperfect self also has character. The question is whether you can appreciate that character or whether you will keep fighting against it in pursuit of an impossible ideal. In ancient China, there lived a painter named Liang who had become famous for his landscape paintings. His work was technically brilliant, displaying perfect control of brush and ink, accurate representation of nature, and compositions that followed all the traditional aesthetic principles. His paintings were collected by wealthy patrons and praised by critics. Yet Liang himself felt increasingly dissatisfied. His paintings felt lifeless to him, correct but empty, perfect in form but lacking in spirit. One day, Liang heard of a reclusive painter named Wu who lived high in the mountains and painted in a completely unorthodox style. People described Wu's work as wild, unpredictable, sometimes barely recognizable as depicting anything specific. Critics dismissed it as amateurish and sloppy. But something in these descriptions intrigued Liang. He decided to make the difficult journey to Wu's mountain retreat. When Liang arrived and saw Wu's paintings for himself, he was shocked. They violated nearly every principle he had been taught. The brushwork was spontaneous, almost chaotic. The compositions were asymmetrical and unbalanced. The subjects were sometimes abstracted beyond recognition. By all the standards Liang had mastered, these paintings were failures. Yet they possessed something his own perfect works lacked: vitality, immediacy, a sense that they captured something essential about the experience of being alive in the natural world. Liang asked Wu about his approach to painting. The old mountain painter laughed. "Approach? I do not have an approach. I go into the mountains. I experience the mountain. I let the mountain enter me until there is no difference between the mountain and myself. Then I come to my paper, and the mountain paints itself through me. I do not try to make a perfect representation. I try to capture the feeling, the essence, the direct experience." "But what about technique?" Liang asked. "What about the principles of composition, the rules of brushwork, the traditional forms that create beautiful paintings?" Wu shrugged. "I know those things. I studied them as a young man. But they are like scaffolding, useful when building, but meant to be removed once the building is complete. If you leave the scaffolding in place forever, you cannot actually inhabit the building. You live in the structure that was only meant to be temporary support." He continued, "Your paintings that I have heard described, they sound like scaffolding that was never removed. All structure, all technique, all rules. But where is the life? Where is the direct experience of mountain, of mist, of stone, of wind? You have learned to paint perfectly, but have you learned to paint truthfully? These are not the same thing." Liang spent several weeks with Wu, learning or perhaps unlearning. Wu encouraged him to paint quickly, without deliberation, without planning, without the careful consideration that Liang had spent years perfecting. "Do not think about how to paint the pine tree," Wu would say. "Become the pine tree, then let your hand move." At first, this approach produced terrible results. Liang's paintings looked like crude sketches, incompetent and ugly. But Wu encouraged him to continue, to push past his trained perfectionism. Gradually, something began to shift. In moments when Liang forgot to judge what he was doing, when he stopped trying to make perfect paintings and simply allowed his experience to flow through his brush, something else emerged. These paintings were still technically imperfect, still violated many traditional principles, but they had energy and authenticity that his perfect works had lacked. They felt alive. When Liang eventually returned to his home and studio, he was a changed painter. He did not abandon his technical skills, but he stopped letting them dominate his work. He allowed himself to paint spontaneously, to make bold choices that violated rules, to pursue the feeling and essence of his subjects rather than perfect representation. Some of his long-time patrons were confused or disappointed by this new work. They had collected his paintings precisely because of their technical perfection, and now he was creating pieces that seemed almost rough or unfinished. But other people responded to the new work with enthusiasm. They felt something in these paintings that moved them, a vitality and presence that perfect technique alone could not provide. Young painters especially were inspired, seeing that it was possible to pursue genuine expression rather than just technical perfection. Liang's reputation evolved. He was no longer praised as a perfect technician, but as a genuine artist, someone who used skill in service of authentic expression rather than as an end in itself. Near the end of his life, Liang wrote a treatise on painting that became influential. In it, he made a distinction that captured what he had learned from Wu. There are two kinds of painting, he wrote. One uses technique to impress the viewer, to demonstrate mastery, to create objects that are admired for their perfection. The other uses technique to communicate experience, to share something true about what it feels like to be alive and aware in this world. The first kind of painting can be perfect. The second kind cannot be and should not be, because direct experience is always imperfect, always messy, always exceeding our ability to capture it completely. Which kind of painting is more valuable? That depends on what you value, perfection or truth. This teaching extends far beyond painting. In every creative endeavor, indeed in life itself, we face this choice between perfection and truth, between impressing others and expressing authentically, between following all the rules correctly and communicating something genuine, even if it breaks some rules. We are taught, usually from early childhood, to value the first path, color inside the lines. Follow the instructions. Do it the right way. Give the correct answer. Perform according to standards. These teachings are not inherently wrong. Learning technique, understanding principles, developing discipline, these have real value. But if we stop there, if we mistake mastery of technique for the goal itself, we end up like Liang before his mountain retreat, technically perfect, but spiritually empty. We become accomplished at performing life according to external standards, while losing touch with our own authentic experience and expression. What would change if you approached your life the way Wu approached painting? What if you stopped trying to create the perfect performance and instead tried to express what is genuinely true about your experience, even if that expression is messy, imperfect, and does not always follow the rules? This does not mean abandoning all discipline or skill. It means using whatever skill you have in service of authenticity rather than in service of an impossible perfection. Your life is not meant to be a perfect painting admired by critics. It is meant to be a genuine expression of your unique experience of being alive. That expression will necessarily be imperfect because you are a finite human being trying to engage with an infinite and ever-changing reality. But that imperfect, authentic expression has value that no perfect performance can match. It is real. It is yours. It is enough. In a monastery in ancient Thailand, there was a tradition of creating beautiful flower offerings for the Buddha statues. These offerings were considered a form of devotion, and great care was taken to arrange the flowers perfectly, creating aesthetically pleasing designs that demonstrated reverence and skill. A young nun named Siriporn took this duty very seriously, spending hours arranging flowers, removing any blooms that were less than perfect, adjusting the designs until they met her exacting standards. Siriporn would become stressed and upset if she saw a flower beginning to wilt in one of her arrangements, quickly removing it and replacing it with a fresh bloom. She could not bear the sight of imperfection in these sacred offerings. The other nuns sometimes found her intensity exhausting, but they respected her devotion and allowed her to maintain this practice. One rainy season, a senior nun named Ajahn Noi invited Siriporn to join her for a walking meditation in the monastery gardens. As they walked, Ajahn Noi stopped before a flower bed where some blooms were perfect and fresh. while others were wilting and dying. She stood there in silence for a long time, simply observing. Finally, she asked Siriporn, "Which of these flowers is offering itself to the Buddha?" Siriporn was confused by the question. "The fresh ones, of course, the beautiful ones. That's why I select only the best blooms for the altar." Ajahn Noi smiled gently. "Is that so? Tell me, does the wilting flower refuse to be a flower? Does it apologize for aging? Does it try to hide its impermanence?" Siriporn shook her head, unsure where this was leading. "Each flower," Ajahn continued, "perfect or imperfect, fresh or dying, is offering its Buddha nature completely. The beautiful flower does not offer more of itself than the wilting one. Both are expressing the Dharma of impermanence, the truth that everything arises, exists for a time, and then passes away. When you select only perfect flowers for the altar, you are offering a lie. You are suggesting that the Buddha values only beauty and perfection, only the fresh and the new. But the Buddha taught about all of existence, not just the pleasant parts." She gestured to a flower that was half faded, its petals beginning to brown at the edges. "This flower is teaching the Dharma. It is demonstrating impermanence, the first mark of existence. When you remove such flowers from the altar, you are removing the teaching. You are trying to create a perfect offering to honor teachings about the impossibility of perfection. Do you see the contradiction?" Siriporn felt something shift in her understanding. She had thought she was honoring the Buddha through her perfect flower arrangements. But Ajahn Noi was suggesting that her rejection of imperfection actually contradicted the fundamental teachings she was supposedly honoring. The Buddha had not taught about a perfect, unchanging reality. He had taught about this imperfect, constantly changing reality, and how to live within it with wisdom and compassion. From that day forward, Siriporn changed how she created flower offerings. She still arranged them with care and attention, but she no longer rejected flowers that showed signs of age or imperfection. She allowed full blooms and fading blooms to sit side by side. She let her arrangements show the natural life cycle of flowers, rather than trying to freeze them in a moment of perfect freshness. She stopped removing wilting flowers immediately, instead allowing them to teach through their fading. Interestingly, the flower offerings became more beautiful in this new form, at least to eyes that could appreciate the fuller truth they expressed. They had more depth, more reality, more genuine teaching power. Visitors to the monastery often found themselves contemplating these arrangements, seeing in them the nature of their own lives. Moments of fresh beauty alongside moments of fading, all part of the same natural process, all equally valid expressions of being alive. Years later, Siriporn was teaching a new group of young nuns about caring for the monastery. One asked her about creating flower offerings, expecting detailed instructions about selecting perfect blooms and creating aesthetically pleasing arrangements. Instead, Siriporn taught, "Bring flowers to the altar with the same respect you would bring to a teacher who has suffered greatly and gained wisdom through that suffering. Bring the wilting along with the fresh, the imperfect along with the beautiful. Let the arrangement tell the truth about existence, that everything is temporary, everything is always changing, and this impermanent, changing reality is what we are here to understand and accept. Not what we are here to fight against or pretend is different than it is." She continued, "When I was young, I thought perfect flower offerings honored the Buddha. Now I understand that honest flower offerings honor the Buddha. Perfection is dishonest. It pretends that life is different than it actually is. Honesty includes the whole truth, beauty and decay, arising and passing, perfection and imperfection, all woven together, all part of the pattern, all worthy of being seen and accepted." This teaching applies far beyond flower arrangements in monasteries. We live in a culture that desperately tries to hide imperfection, aging, decay, and death. We Photoshop wrinkles from pictures. We bury the elderly in institutions rather than having them present in daily life. We speak of death in euphemisms. We present only our best moments on social media. We are creating collective flower arrangements that show only fresh, perfect blooms, while frantically hiding everything that reminds us of impermanence and decay. But this strategy does not protect us from the reality of impermanence. It only leaves us unprepared when impermanence inevitably affects our own lives. When we, or someone we love ages, becomes ill, faces death, we are shocked and devastated rather than accepting this as a natural part of the cycle we have observed countless times in nature. By trying to create perfect lives that deny imperfection and impermanence, we make ourselves more fragile, not less. What would it mean to create flower arrangements in your own life that tell the truth? To include the wilting alongside the fresh, to acknowledge aging alongside youth, to make space for struggle alongside success. This is not about dwelling on negative things or becoming pessimistic. It is about developing the capacity to be present with the full spectrum of human experience, not just the parts that fit our ideas of how things should be. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you can acknowledge the truth that you are aging with every breath, that you are closer to death than you were yesterday, that your body is in the process of both renewal and decay. This is not morbid. This is simply true. And accepting this truth, rather than fighting against it or pretending it is not real, is the foundation of wisdom. You are like the flower arrangement on the monastery altar, part fresh bloom, part fading petal, part stem and thorn, all of it a perfect expression of being alive in this imperfect, temporary, and therefore precious existence. In medieval Korea, there lived a ceramics master named Park, who specialized in creating tea bowls for the elaborate tea ceremonies practiced by Buddhist monks and nobles. Park had studied for decades under various masters, learning to create bowls that were nearly perfect, symmetrical, smooth, with even glaze and pleasing proportions. His bowls were technically excellent, and he enjoyed steady business from patrons who appreciated his reliable craftsmanship. One year, Park traveled to Japan to study with a renowned tea master named Rikyu. Park expected to learn advanced techniques that would make his already excellent bowls even more perfect. But what he encountered confused and frustrated him. Rikyu's favored tea bowls were often asymmetrical, with uneven glaze, rough textures, and what Park would have considered obvious flaws. Yet these imperfect bowls were highly prized, sometimes valued more than technically perfect ones. Park asked Rikyu directly, "Master, I have spent my life learning to create perfect bowls, yet you seem to prefer imperfect ones. Am I wasting my time with my training?" Rikyu prepared tea using one of these imperfect bowls, and they drank together in silence before he answered. "Your technical skill is excellent. Your bowls are perfect in the way a machine's output might be perfect. Consistent, predictable, correct. But they are also somehow distant, impersonal. They do not invite touch or contemplation. They say nothing about being human." He held up the bowl they had been using. This bowl was made by hands that know technique but are not enslaved by it. The potter allowed the clay to have its own nature, the fire to work its transformation, the glaze to flow where it would. The result is unique, alive, bearing the marks of all the forces that created it. When I hold this bowl, I feel the whole process of its creation. I sense the human being who made it, the materials that form it, the fire that changed it. It is a conversation between potter, materials, and fire, not a one-sided imposition of perfect form. Park spent months studying with Rikyu, not just observing, but practicing this different approach to pottery. At first, it was impossibly difficult. Every time he tried to allow imperfection, his years of training toward perfection would intervene, correcting, smoothing, fixing. He would find himself unconsciously moving toward symmetry, toward refinement, toward eliminating any roughness or irregularity. The The bowls he created in this transition period were the worst of both worlds, neither perfectly executed nor authentically imperfect, just confused and timid. Rikyu gave him a practice to create quickly without giving his perfectionist training time to intervene. Throw the bowl in 10 minutes, Rikyu would instruct. Shape it, finish it, and put it directly in the kiln. No refinement, no perfecting, no hesitation. Park was horrified by the results at first. These hastily made bowls violated everything he believed about proper craftsmanship. But Rikyu encouraged him to keep going, to make many such bowls, to move faster than his perfectionism could follow. Something gradually shifted. Among the many crude bowls Park produced in this way, there began to appear pieces that had something special, a quality Park could not quite name but could definitely feel. They were still imperfect by his old standards, but they possessed vitality and presence. They felt honest, expressive of both the materials and the hand that shaped them. They invited touch and use in a way his perfect bowls never had. Rikyu explained, "You are discovering the difference between correctness and truth. A correct bowl follows all the rules, demonstrates all the techniques, shows no errors. A true bowl shows what actually happened during its creation, the hesitations and certainties of the potter, the responses of the clay, the accidents of the fire, all present and visible rather than hidden behind a mask of perfection." Which kind of bowl better expresses the Buddhist teaching of seeing reality as it is? Park returned to Korea changed. He did not abandon his technical skills, but he no longer used them to pursue perfection. Instead, he allowed his skills to work in collaboration with the materials and the process, being present for what emerged rather than imposing a predetermined ideal. His new work divided his former patrons. Some felt he had lost his way, that his bowls had become sloppy and inferior. Others recognized that something had deepened in his work, that these new bowls had a quality his earlier perfect ones had lacked. Park found that he no longer needed everyone's approval. He could let go of patrons who wanted only technical perfection, focusing on those who appreciated the quality he was now pursuing, authenticity. And interestingly, as he released the need for approval through perfection, his work became more recognized and valued, not less. He attracted patrons who were themselves on a spiritual path, who understood that the imperfect bowl expressed something more profound than the perfect one could. In his later years, Park wrote a short text about pottery that also became recognized as a teaching about life. In it, he wrote, "I spent the first half of my career learning to eliminate imperfection from my work. I spent the second half learning to eliminate the need for perfection from my heart. The first half produced correct bowls. The second half produced true bowls. If I had continued on the first path, I would have eventually created bowls that were indistinguishable from machine-made objects, flawless and dead. By following the second path, I created bowls that were obviously human, flawed and alive. I cannot tell you which choice is correct for you, but I can tell you which choice brought me peace." Park's journey from technical perfection to authentic expression is one that many people need to make in various domains. We start by learning the rules, mastering the techniques, striving to do things correctly. This phase is necessary and valuable. But if we stop there, if we never move beyond correctness to authenticity, we remain somewhat mechanical in our functioning, even if highly skilled. The second phase, which is more difficult and more frightening, is learning when and how to set aside perfect execution in favor of genuine expression. This applies not just to crafts and arts, but to how we conduct our entire lives. We learn social rules, professional protocols, relationship patterns, all the correct ways to be human in our particular culture. But at some point, if we are to become fully ourselves rather than just well-programmed social units, we need to discover what is genuinely true for us, even when it deviates from the perfect model. We need to make bowls that bear our authentic fingerprints, even if those fingerprints are considered flaws by people who value only technical perfection. Where in your life are you still in the first phase, pursuing correctness at the expense of authenticity? Where have you been creating perfect but somehow dead expressions of yourself, rather than imperfect but alive ones? And what would it take to make the transition Park made, not abandoning skill, but subordinating it to truth, using your capabilities in service of genuine expression, rather than in pursuit of flawless performance? In a small village in ancient Japan, there lived a gardener named Hiro, who maintained the gardens of a local temple. Hiro had studied the art of Japanese gardening extensively and took great pride in keeping the temple grounds absolutely perfect. Every stone was precisely placed, every tree carefully pruned, every moss patch cultivated to exact specifications. The garden looked as if it had been frozen in an ideal state, unchanging and controlled. Hiro worked tirelessly to maintain this perfection. He would remove every fallen leaf immediately, replace any plant that showed signs of aging or disease, and ensure that every element remained exactly as it should be. The garden was indeed beautiful, but it required constant vigilance and effort to maintain. Hiro had little time for anything else in his life, as the garden consumed all his energy and attention. One autumn, Hiro fell seriously ill and was bedridden for many weeks. He was distraught, knowing that the garden would deteriorate without his constant care. He imagined with horror the leaves accumulating on paths, the moss being overtaken by weeds, the careful arrangements falling into disorder. When he finally recovered enough to visit the garden, he approached with dread, expecting to see his life's work ruined. What he found surprised him profoundly. The garden had indeed changed. Fallen leaves covered portions of the paths and gathered around the stones. Some plants had grown beyond their carefully maintained shapes. A few trees had dropped branches in storms. But the garden was not ruined. In fact, it possessed a quality that Hiro had to admit his perfectly maintained garden had lacked. It looked alive, natural, like an actual part of the landscape, rather than a carefully controlled museum exhibit. Hiro sat on a bench in this changed garden for a long time, experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. Part of him wanted to immediately begin restoring the garden to its previous perfection. But another part, perhaps made wise by his illness and brush with mortality, could see that something valuable had emerged during his absence. The garden had been allowed to be itself, to respond to the seasons, to change naturally, and in that natural change there was a beauty and authenticity that his rigid control had prevented. The head monk of the temple, who had been watching Hiro's reaction, came to sit beside him. "The garden has been teaching while you were away," the monk said gently. "It has been teaching about impermanence, about natural cycles, about the difference between control and care. Your skill and knowledge created a beautiful foundation, but your need for perfection was preventing the garden from expressing its true nature. A living garden must be allowed to live, which means allowed to change, to age, to respond to each season and weather." Hiro protested weakly. "But the garden principles, the aesthetic ideals, they require careful maintenance to preserve the design." The monk nodded. "Yes, and there is value in those principles and in your skillful maintenance. But there is a difference between maintaining the garden and strangling it. Before your illness, you were so focused on preventing any deviation from your ideal that you had stopped allowing the garden to breathe. Look at these leaves scattered on the path. Do they not speak of autumn more eloquently than any perfect arrangement could?" Over the following weeks, as Hiro gradually returned to his duties, he developed a new relationship with the garden. He still applied his skills and knowledge, still pruned and maintained and cared for the plants. But he released his grip on perfection. He allowed fallen leaves to remain for a time, creating the seasonal atmosphere of autumn before eventually clearing them. He permitted plants to develop their natural forms more, intervening less to force them into ideal shapes. He accepted that some stones would shift slightly over time, that moss would grow where it would, that the garden was a living system that he could guide, but not completely control. The garden under this new approach had more variation, more seasonal character, more life. Some visitors, who had known the previous perfectly maintained garden, preferred this new version, finding it more emotionally resonant and peaceful. Others missed the previous perfection, feeling the garden had become less impressive. Hiro found he could accept both responses without needing everyone to see things his way. He had discovered something more important than universal admiration. He had found a way of caring for the garden that did not exhaust him, that allowed for change and life rather than fighting against these fundamental forces. Years later, a young gardener came to study with Hiro, hoping to learn the secrets of creating a perfect garden. Hiro smiled at the request, recognizing his younger self. "I can teach you many techniques," he said, "but if you want to learn to create a perfect garden, you have come to the wrong teacher. I know how to create perfect gardens, and I spent years doing so. But now I'm learning something more difficult and more valuable: how to create living gardens. A perfect garden is a fantasy, an ideal that exists in the mind but nowhere in nature. A living garden is always imperfect, always changing, always responding to forces beyond your control. Which would you rather learn to create?" The young student thought about this carefully. "I suppose a living garden, though I confess I do not fully understand the difference yet." Hiro laughed. "Good answer. The difference will become clear through practice. But I can tell you this: a perfect garden requires you to fight against nature constantly. A living garden requires you to work with nature, even when nature does things you had not planned. A perfect garden makes you its slave. A living garden makes you its companion. I spent half my life enslaved. I am spending my remaining time in companionship." This teaching extends to how we approach our own lives and selves. How often do we treat ourselves like Hiro treated his garden before his illness, trying to maintain perfect control, immediately fixing any deviation from our ideal, fighting constantly against natural changes and cycles? We exhaust ourselves trying to keep our bodies looking exactly right, our emotions perfectly regulated, our circumstances arranged just so. We treat ourselves as projects to be perfected rather than as living systems to be cared for with wisdom and compassion. What would it mean to approach yourself the way Hiro learned to approach his garden? To maintain and care for yourself skillfully while also allowing for natural change, seasonal variation, and imperfect responses to circumstances beyond your control. To see your aging, your emotional ups and downs, your changing circumstances not as failures to maintain perfection, but as natural expressions of being alive in an ever-changing world. The garden that taught Hiro about imperfection was more beautiful and more true than the perfect garden he had maintained through exhausting effort. Your imperfect, changing, uncontrollable life is more beautiful and more true than the perfect life you exhaust yourself trying to maintain. Tonight, you can rest from that effort. You can be like the garden during Hiro's illness, allowed to be yourself, responding naturally to the seasons of your life, imperfect and alive. In ancient China, there was a master archer named Li, who could hit any target with perfect accuracy. His skill was legendary, and students came from distant provinces to learn from him. Li taught the traditional methods with exacting precision. Every student learned to stand in exactly the right position, hold the bow in exactly the right way, breathe according to exact specifications, and release the arrow at exactly the right moment. Those who followed his instructions perfectly became excellent archers. Those who could not achieve this perfection were considered failures. Among Li's students was a young woman named Mei who struggled despite years of practice. She could hit targets consistently, but not with the flawless accuracy Li demanded. There was always some small deviation, some minor imperfection in her form or her results. Li would constantly correct her, pointing out minute errors in her stance or her release. Mei worked harder and harder, becoming increasingly tense and frustrated, which only made her shooting worse. One day, a wandering teacher named Chen arrived at the archery school. Chen was known as an unconventional master who had studied many different styles and synthesized them into his own approach. Li was skeptical of Chen's unorthodox methods, but agreed to let him observe the training. Chen watched in silence for several days, paying particular attention to May's struggles. Finally, Chen asked Li's permission to work with May briefly. Li agreed, curious what this unconventional teacher might do. Chen took May aside and gave her surprising instructions. I want you to intentionally shoot imperfectly, aim for the target, but do not worry about hitting the center. In fact, deliberately hit different parts of the target. Experiment with your stance, your grip, your release. Try things that you know are incorrect according to your training. Make mistakes on purpose. May was confused and resistant. This seemed to contradict everything she had been working so hard to achieve. But something in Chen's calm confidence made her willing to try. She began shooting incorrectly, deliberately varying her form and her aim. At first, it felt wrong and uncomfortable, but gradually, as she released the pressure of trying to be perfect, something shifted. She began to notice things about archery that her fixation on perfect form had obscured. She felt how different stances affected her balance in different ways. She discovered that some incorrect methods actually worked better for her body than the standard perfect form. After several hours of this experimental practice, Chen gave her new instructions. Now shoot naturally. Do not think about correct form or perfect accuracy. Just look at the target, trust your body, and shoot. May did as instructed, and to her amazement, her arrow flew more truly than it had in months, landing very near the center of the target. She shot again and again, each time with this same quality of relaxed naturalness, and her accuracy was consistently better than it had been when she was trying so hard to be perfect. Chen explained, "You have excellent technique that you learned from Master Li, but you were imprisoning yourself in that technique, making it a cage rather than a foundation. By deliberately practicing imperfectly, you released your fixation on perfect form and reconnected with the actual purpose of archery, hitting the target. Your body knows how to do this. Years of practice have taught it deeply, but your mind was interfering, constantly monitoring and correcting, never allowing your natural ability to flow." He continued, "Master Li teaches one kind of perfection, perfect replication of an ideal form. This has value, especially for beginners who need structure and clear guidance. But there is another kind of mastery, the ability to adapt, to respond to each unique situation, to let your deep training express itself naturally without conscious interference. This second kind of mastery must include imperfection, because reality is always different from our ideals, always requiring adjustment and response, rather than rigid replication." Li had been watching this exchange, and while his pride was hurt, he was also honest enough to recognize the truth in Chen's teaching. That evening, the two masters talked long into the night. Li shared his concern. "If I teach students that imperfection is acceptable, will they not become sloppy and undisciplined? Does not mastery require the pursuit of perfection?" Chen responded thoughtfully. Mastery requires two phases. First, the student must learn perfect form, must practice with discipline and precision until the techniques become deeply embedded. You teach this phase excellently. But then, there must be a second phase, learning to set aside perfect form, to allow the deeply embedded techniques to function naturally without constant conscious control. This phase requires practicing imperfectly, making mistakes, experimenting, rediscovering the purpose that the perfect form serves. Without this second phase, the student remains forever a talented beginner, capable of perfect execution, but incapable of true mastery. Li considered this carefully. He realized that he himself had made this transition years ago. His famous perfect accuracy came not from consciously executing perfect form, but from years of perfect practice that had become natural and unconscious. He shot perfectly without thinking about perfection, but he had never articulated this understanding or taught his students how to make this same transition. He had taught the first phase excellently, but had not recognized or taught the second phase. From that time forward, Li incorporated Chen's wisdom into his teaching. He still taught perfect form to beginners, giving them the structure they needed to develop skill. But with advanced students, he introduced practices of intentional imperfection, experimental shooting, and letting go of conscious control. His school became known not just for producing technically excellent archers, but for producing truly masterful ones who could perform well under any conditions, adapting to circumstances rather than rigidly applying perfect technique. Mei became one of Li's most successful students, eventually a master in her own right. When people asked about her path to mastery, she would tell them, "I learned to shoot perfectly, and then I learned to shoot imperfectly, and in learning both, I discovered how to simply shoot." This statement confused many people, but those who understood its deeper meaning found it profoundly liberating. This teaching applies far beyond archery. In any domain, there are these two phases: learning the rules perfectly, and then learning when and how to break them or set them aside. Many people never make it to the second phase, remaining stuck in rigid application of techniques they have learned. They can execute perfectly when conditions match their training, but they cannot adapt when reality presents something different. Where in your life are you stuck in the first phase, rigidly applying what you have learned without the flexibility that true mastery requires? Where have you become enslaved to perfect form rather than freed by it? And what would it look like to practice imperfection, to experiment, to rediscover the purpose beneath the technique you have perfected? This is not about abandoning discipline or skill. It is about completing your mastery by learning to hold your skills lightly, using them naturally and adaptively, rather than treating them as laws that must never be violated. In a Buddhist monastery in ancient Vietnam, there was a tradition that each monk would memorize and recite certain important sutras as part of their training. A young monk named Tan took this practice extremely seriously, spending countless hours ensuring that he could recite the assigned texts with absolutely perfect accuracy. Every word, every pause, every inflection was practiced until it matched the traditional recitation style precisely. Tan took pride in his perfect memorization, believing it demonstrated his devotion and discipline. During the annual gathering where monks would demonstrate their learning, Tan recited his sutra flawlessly. Every word was correct, every pause properly placed, every tone accurate. The performance was technically perfect. Yet afterward, the monastery's elder teacher, Thai Min, asked Tan to stay behind for a conversation. "Your recitation was absolutely perfect," Thai Min began. "Not a single error, not a moment's hesitation, a flawless performance. Tell me, what does the sutra mean?" Than was confused by the question. "It is the Heart Sutra, teaching about emptiness and form, about the nature of reality." Thai Min nodded. "Yes, that is what the words say. But what does it mean? Has the teaching entered your understanding, or have you merely memorized sounds?" Than felt defensive. "I have studied the meaning as well as the words. I understand the philosophical concepts it presents." The elder teacher smiled gently. "I'm sure you do, intellectually. But I watched your face as you recited. I saw concentration on accuracy, concern about making mistakes, pride in your flawless performance. I did not see understanding. I did not see someone sharing a teaching that had transformed them. I saw someone performing words perfectly while remaining unchanged by their meaning." This observation struck Than deeply. He recognized its truth immediately. He had been so focused on perfect recitation that he had treated the sutra as a text to be mastered rather than as a teaching to be absorbed. The words had entered his memory but not his heart. He knew what the sutra said, but he had not really grappled with what it meant or how it applied to his life. Thai Min continued. "There are two kinds of perfect recitation. One is the perfection of technique, every word correct, every sound properly formed, the performance flawless. You have achieved this, and it required real discipline and effort. But there is another kind, the perfection of understanding, where perhaps you stumble over words. Perhaps you do not remember every phrase precisely, but the meaning has penetrated so deeply that it flows through you naturally, expressed in your own words, mixed with the traditional ones, alive rather than frozen. The teacher shared a story. When I was young, like you, I could recite many sutras perfectly. I was very proud of this ability. Then I met an old nun who had spent decades in remote practice. I asked her to recite the Heart Sutra, wanting to hear how someone so advanced would perform it. She tried but kept mixing up the order of phrases, inserting her own words, pausing in wrong places. By the standards I had learned, her recitation was terrible. But when she finished, I realized I had understood the Heart Sutra for the first time. She had not recited it perfectly, but she had transmitted its meaning perfectly, because she had lived with it so long that it was no longer separate from her understanding. Thai Min gave Than a new practice. For the next month, do not recite the Heart Sutra from memory.